Okay, good morning and welcome. My name is David Orr. I'm the director here with your New York State LTAP Center, part of the Cornell Local Roads program. And welcome to an online workshop, an introduction to combating roadway departures. It's actually going to be done over a couple of days, this Thursday and next. I'll talk about that more in just a minute. Um, we will be doing some interactive stuff during the day. So let's go through a few settings to make sure everybody's on the same page. Down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see an audio settings issue. If you've got a problem, just type in to the Q&A, open up your Q&A pod, and they can help you out. But that's where you can set your speakers and stuff like that. And Jody and Amanda and Michelle in the background will help make sure everything's kosher and running there. We do recommend you open up your chat pod. The chat pod is a one-way. We'll send you information. We're going to send you links to a couple of documents. Um, and then we will probably ask you to raise your hand now and then, and we'll also ask you to do things in the Q&A. So make sure the Q&A and the chat are open, and we are going to be doing some polls via Poll EV. We'll talk about that when we do the first one here in a minute. Now, just so you know, if you are trying to get a professional development hour, this is a professional development hour, and it should actually be three. You know, you go through slides and you kind of change things, but here's the cool stuff. I can change this on the fly. This is 3 professional development hours here in New York State. Okay. It's worth 3 professional development hours if you're here all day. We set the class up so it's going to be 2 different sessions, and each one will be self-standing. But it's only the person who's registered. So we need that information from you. And it counts as a course, so that's not as critical as it used to be here. If you're from outside New York State, check with your LTAP center in your state to see what are the requirements for professional development hours. Now, this particular class is actually derived from 3 sources. Okay. One source is an NHI class called Combating Roadway Departures. I've taught that class for almost a decade now, now and then. And so part of this materials comes from that, the NHI materials, but we had to modify them to fit in this online format. So there's some changes there. There was a new set of slides and new information and updated data, which we'll be sharing from 2024. So I have some updated information that's not all the way to 2024, but it's close. And then, of course, didn't want to forget about all the materials that were available for the webinars that we did with this New York State Department of Transportation's Roadway Safety Action Plan. And so there's materials that we are pulling from that as well, which includes, of course, our materials from some of our classes, like Solutions for Safer Roads and Streets, and the Proven Safety Countermeasures from the FHWA and what New York State DOT approved as part of the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. All of these are outlined in the materials. You don't need to memorize any of this stuff. So what I would tell you is make sure you look at the handout. There's a link in the chat, okay? And if you can't access it for some reason, just put an email address in the Q&A and we can email it to you. But make sure you look at that handout, and I'm going to pull that up. And so you've got a handout that's got the schedule for this week and next week. It's got a list of the proven countermeasures that are specifically related to roadway departures. You'll understand that more towards the end of this morning's session. And then on pages 3 and 4 are a lot of resources. And that's something you definitely want to go look at the resources, including a copy of the handout from our old version of Combating Roadway Departures, which has some good resources in the back. Our traffic sign handbook, which we're updating, materials from New York State DOT, Federal Highway Administration, and others such as AASHTO. So you definitely want to look through those resources, make notes. The real value here is later on looking at things. Okay. Now, if you're looking at the Combating Roadway Departures handout, there's a table of contents. It's towards the front. Okay. And then in the back, I would absolutely recommend going to the back, looking at the resources that start on 107, page 107 if you're looking at the bottom, but 124 if you're doing it in PDF format, if you know how to maneuver around there. And yeah, some of the resources links might be broken. I did catch 1 or 2 that were, but if you just search for the title, you can find them. Okay. So they're all still available, just in slightly different format in some cases. Okay. Now, everything that's on the handout we checked, that's current, that's active, and it's most up to date. So that's where I would start if I was looking at things. So let's get back to our class. What are we doing over the next 2 Thursdays? Well, today we're going to be doing an introduction to combating roadway departures. So for the first hour, we're going to be talking about the roadway departure problem, going through what's involved. Okay. Then we're going to spend an hour talking about how do we get to safety. Now, we're going to focus on the roadway departure problem, but the reality is any safety related problem, these techniques will work. And so the last hour, we're actually going to go through review of proven countermeasures. And as we decide to set this up as two independent sessions, that when we want to actually cover all the proven countermeasures, not just those focused on combating roadway departures, though we'll talk about them as well, because you are going to come across other issues. We want you to understand there's lots of countermeasures out there that you might want to put into your toolkit if you're not using them already. Then next Thursday, we're going to go through those proven countermeasures specifically focused on combating roadway departures, including those that help keep vehicles on the roadway, improve the chances of a safe recovery, and minimize the severity of the crashes that occur. Now, why are we worried about all of this? Why is this such an issue? Now, again, I'm taking a risk. I am going to play a few videos, and online always is risky with videos, but this is a video we got from Emmett McDevitt, who used to work with the Federal Highway Administration Division Office here in New York State. And it's sadly, it shows car crashes that led to fatalities. And I could play this. It's like a 10 minutes worth of things. I'm not showing 10 minutes. It's just to illustrate what's going on. And yet the funny thing is, or the sad thing is, depending on how you want to look at it, most of us don't think about this on a daily basis. And yet there are still people thinking about plane crashes that have occurred weeks and even months ago. We tend to focus on the big events, and yet these small events that lead to fatalities and serious injuries change people's lives, and the numbers aren't where we'd like them to be. So that's really the goal, everybody getting home safely every single day. Now, if you go to both sessions, what are you going to be picking up and learning? Well, I'm hoping you're going to be able to describe the roadway departure crash problem, and we'll talk about why I've highlighted the word crash here in a minute. I want you to make sure you understand the concept of systemic safety. We're going to talk about other approaches, system-wide approaches, and hotspots and site-specific things, but the systemic safety one is definitely one I want to make sure is in your toolkit that you're aware of. And then discuss the countermeasures to reduce the potential for leaving the roadway, which is our first choice. If they do leave the roadway, the vehicle, we want to reduce the potential for an actual crash. And then if there is a crash, we want to minimize the severity. Okay, that's our goals if you go to both sessions. Today, we're going to focus really on the first idea, but we are going to briefly touch on the others as well. And again, what's our number one goal? Everybody getting home safely every single day. That should be our goal. You've heard the terms towards zero deaths or vision zero. There's other terms that are used out there, but they all have the same idea. Everyone should get home safely every single day. And if you're wondering, that's my mom, who's the baby, my grandmother, and an airplane that my grandpapa actually built and designed. So it's pretty cool. We found that in some old records. But, that's the goal. We want everybody to get home every single day. Now, when we put this together, we always put a little bit more in here than we probably have time for. And you're going to help me focus a little bit. I think I know what the answers are, but I never assume. We know what that gives us. So we're going to do our first few polls. And again, we're going to be using pollev.com/DavidOrPE, and get your chat pod open up. In about 10 seconds, make sure your chat pod's opened up. And then Amanda or Jody is going to drop magically into the chat pod the link, so you don't have to type it in. Okay? So the chat pod link, you don't have to memorize it. And we're going to do a few polls to tell me who's here today. I have a list in our database. I looked at it, but let's just see who showed up this morning. It's a beautiful day for doing a workshop. Rain after a few days of really hot weather. Okay. So who do you work for? Town, county, city or village, state or federal, tribal, MPO, consultant, contractor, or like everybody, we're working for the weekend. Let's see what you come up with. Okay. And we got about 50 of us today. So, okay. So we got quite a few state or federal. We've got some city and village. We got just a few county, a lot of consulting folks, and MPO. Okay. So we got a good variety of folks. Okay. That's good to know. And again, if you can't access the polls, for some reason you can't do that during the day, just put your answer into the Q&A. And then I'll just incorporate that into the thoughts and the things that I'm going to give back to you. Okay? Okay, so what do you do? What's your job? Are you an administrator? Are you a highway superintendent or a DPW commissioner or deputy? Are you an engineer? Are you a planner? Are you in the field? Are you a supervisor or a board member? Uh, you do whatever board, the boss tells me to do. I see somebody's put that in. And then none of the above. And again, if you do none of the above, please put that into the Q&A just so I get a sense. And yeah, I expected about 2/3 engineers and a bunch of planners. That's good. Okay. Okay. And a few that do whatever the boss tells you to do. Okay. And then this is one of my favorite things. We'll actually do another example of this later on today. So make sure you're ready. And that is you get to actually click on the screen where you're from. So you click on the map. It's a map of New York State. And if you're from outside New York, well, you can click on something else. And again, I see somebody's put in there where they're from and their title into the Q&A. That helps me. Okay. And we have some folks who are actually in New Hampshire, at least according to the clicking, and somebody out in the middle of Lake Erie. I didn't know you can get Wi-Fi out there, but maybe at the point, that little point that sticks out of Canada. That's always fun when you fly over it. Okay. Make sure, by the way, if you ever fly over Canada, turn off your cell phone to airplane mode. Otherwise, you can get charges as it's trying to find things. You don't want that to happen. Okay, so we got a good variety of locations as well. Okay. Now we're going to do this particular slide next several times the course of today and next Thursday. Okay. You can do here, and we've done this on our other online workshops as well. I will show this at each break. You're allowed to put in any question. I'd rather have your questions. We'll try to answer all of them. If we can't get them answered today, we will try to get back to you on those. But just what questions do you have related to, in this case, combating roadway departures? And again, you can put in any question. And again, that we'll activate this on a regular basis uh, during each one of the breaks. So you don't feel bad about asking a question, and it's all anonymous anyway. So just go ahead and ask your questions. And if you don't, again, can't ask the polls, please put them into the Q&A pod. So let's get started with our first session on introductions. And again, for this particular session, we're going to be talking about describing the roadway departure crash problem. And what is a roadway departure crash? There's some technical definitions for that. And then we're going to introduce some risk factors for addressing these roadway departure crashes. Okay, so that's what our goal is today. Now, before we get into this, I will still mess this up too. Okay, I was trained, like a lot of you probably have been around a while, in the term crash versus accident. Okay, well, the term crash is what we use today. And the reason is we don't want to get into the blame game. We just want to look at the event. We can worry about who's at fault and all that liability stuff later. We want to focus on the crash and what we can do to keep the next crash from occurring. So if you think of it this way, little ones have accidents. Hey, I'll get a new picture here soon. We have a staff member going to get us a new picture. There we go. Versus a vehicle has a crash. We're just worried about the event itself. Okay. So we don't worry about blame. We don't worry about that issue. We worry about the crash and then trying to figure out how to keep the next crash from occurring. Now, when it comes to crashes, we have to worry about the probability a crash is going to occur. If we're in a place that's got a lot of issues, that could be a problem for us. We want to look at those high probability locations, and that's where we want to focus our efforts. And of course, we also care about the severity of the crash. If all we're getting is property damage, we'll trade that for getting rid of a bunch of serious crashes or even a few of them because the change of life is so great. That's why we like roundabouts, and we'll talk about roundabouts just a little bit today because, again, I want to cover some proven countermeasures. And then finally, we use the term exposure Think about what exposure is here in just a minute. Now, probability. Like here, what's the probability people are actually using the security gate? Well, probably not as high as you'd like it to be. And so think about is situations on your roadways where the probability of a crash is higher. And we'll come back to that and discuss that quite a bit today and next Thursday. We worry a lot about the severity. Now, if you've been to many of our sessions on roadway safety, you've seen this particular picture. This comes from Nevada. If you're out in the western United States where they call what we call guardrail, and you see it, slow down. They're serious. When there's rail or Jersey barrier, in this case, you can see they hit, they really mean it. Okay? Uh, in this particular case, the guy hit the barrier, bounced once, turned 180 degrees, and landed. And you're thinking he's having a bad day. I think he's having the best day of his life. Okay? Because if it hadn't happened, it would have definitely been a fatality. We care a lot about the severity, and this is the kind of things that changes people's lives. Okay? And then finally, exposure. Exposure just means traffic. Okay? It really just means what the amount of traffic is. But the reason we say exposure is because it also deals with the fact that there might be people outside of a vehicle who, if they're involved in a crash, are much more likely to have a severe injury or fatality. So if there's pedestrians involved, workers, okay? I see there was another crash on 81 where someone hit an attenuator yesterday or the day before. Again, we worry about exposure, but it's a form of traffic that we're dealing with as well. Okay? Now, what are we dealing with in terms of fatalities? Well, here's a sad map. It's a map I really wish I didn't have to show. It's the number of fatalities in the United States on an annual basis. Before COVID, that number had dropped down to almost 30,000. It was in the 31,000 range. That number has jumped to over 40,000 fatalities per year, and obviously the serious crash rate's even higher. Um, and even here in New York State, we had a bit of a jump. So that average went up. Okay. We want that number to be down. The real answer should be zero. We really want everybody to get home safely every single day. It may not be feasible. There may be reasons why not, but let's talk about what we can do to get that number at least back down to where it should be and headed in the right direction. Now, the Federal Highway Administration has a crash focus area that has not changed. I was at a meeting in Kansas City last week. There's not a change in that as far as the safety folks are aware. There are some restructurings, but they're still going to focus on roadway departures, intersections, and bicyclists and pedestrians, i.e., people who are not inside a piece of metal, that are, if they're involved in a crash, are much more likely to have that severe event. Okay? And this makes perfect sense. The reason for roadway departures has to do with percentages. Intersections tends to be a lot of interactions with bicycles, pedestrians, and the kind of crashes which are the most severe. And then finally, bicycles and pedestrians because of that, again, vulnerable issue. So what do we deal with in terms of roadway departures? Why did New York State put their first safety action plan in this area? Well, it has to do with percentages. If you look at the number of fatalities that are due to roadway departures, these again are statistics from 2020 to 2022. Okay. So COVID and coming out of COVID period. And as you can see, nationwide, almost half of all fatalities occur are roadway departure fatalities. Okay. And even in states like New York, which have a little bit lower percentage, partly because of a lot more pedestrian and intersection issues in the cities that we've got, it's still a pretty high percentage, 44% of the fatalities. So we'd really like that number to be down, and that's where we're going to focus. So if we look at those data, now this is an interesting one. This chart, which shows the breakdown of crashes based on those three focus areas plus those that were not included for whatever reason, those percentages have not changed. I was actually stunned by this. I'm like, there's got to be something. I went through the data twice. The percentages have not changed within the numbers we were given. So in other words, even though more went up, they went up uniformly almost. So we still have 44% are just related to roadway departures. Okay. 11% are combined with other factors, the intersections and the bike ped issue. Um, so overall, that's where the 49% comes from if you do the breakdown of it. So it's pretty interesting that those really haven't changed much. And so these are the focus areas. And we're focused on roadway departures. So let me define it. This is a definition from the Federal Highway Administration. New York State is very, very close to this. Okay. They are moving to the same definition. It was different, more of a lane departure. But a roadway departure crash, as the Federal Highway Administration is, a crash in which a vehicle crosses an edge line, a center line, or otherwise leaves the traveled way. Now, that actually on a multi-lane road actually means that they move from one lane to the other in an uncontrolled way, by the way, just so you know. We're going to show you some examples of that here in a minute. And if we look at the roadway departure fatalities, that includes head-ons, people crossing the center lines, rollovers where they go off the edge of the roadway, hitting trees, poles, barriers, other fixed objects, other roadside things that are not man-made. And then, of course, there are some fatalities which don't get classified. There's the classic other. Okay. Notice there are three really big areas that we care about. Okay. The head-ons, the rollovers, and hitting trees. But we do worry about other fixed objects as well. So what does that mean by head-on? So this is a roadway departure crash that occurred in Arizona. Okay. Um, so the person had a medical problem, and they wound up in a very, very severe crash. Nobody on the bus was hurt, but the person in the vehicle was severely injured. Okay. That is a roadway departure because they left over the center line and was a head-on. Okay. In terms of these, what are called opposite direction crashes. Okay. Obviously, a lot of them occur on undivided highways, about 84%. Okay. They occur mostly in rural areas, as you'd expect, but there's still a pretty high percentage in urban areas, 30% almost. Okay. Speeds typically are higher when it comes to fatalities. Again, just what you would expect. About 2/3 of the fatalities are high speed, 50 miles an hour or more, but that also means a third are not. Okay. A little bit of concentration occurs, but not as much as you might think, only about a third there. And then an adverse situation where there was two vehicles, both getting involved, about a quarter of the time. So two wrongs don't make a right in this particular case. So opposite direction crashes are something we want to focus on. Now, in terms of roadway departure, here's a roadway departure. Vehicle left the roadway. We'll come back and revisit this particular roadway departure a couple more times, but that's a roadway departure crash. Okay? And they ran off the road into the snow and stopped. Walked away. We'll come back to this particular one, but that's a roadway departure. They left the traveled way completely, okay? And they hit something, okay? In this particular case, just some property damage. And then if I say rollover, a rollover could occur going off the road or even staying within the roadway mostly. And in this case, person swerved a little bit too hard when somebody swerved in front of them, and they rolled 17 or 16 or whatever the number is times. I counted it once. Let's just see if we can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a lot. But because of the vehicle they were in, they were properly seat belted, they walked away with minor injuries. Okay. So something to keep in mind when we come back to that in just a minute. They walked away, but that's a rollover crash, and that's still a roadway departure. Again, a lot of times we might call that a lane departure, but under the definition we're talking about today, that's a roadway departure. Even if they'd stayed in the actual pavement, we'd still count that because it was an uncontrolled leaving of the lane. And why do we care about fixed object crashes? Well, this is the fatalities due to hitting a fixed object. As you can see, it's not quite 50%, but it's a pretty high percentage. And that includes trees, shrubs, signs, poles, other fixed objects that we put up, like big mailboxes, barriers themselves, guide rail, guardrail, Jersey barrier, things like that. The topography of the land could be an issue. rock walls, things like that. And then finally, other fixed objects that, again, Mother Nature has put out there that are not trees and shrubs and in the other list. So it's a pretty high percentage. Okay. The single most common struck object that leads to a fatality is trees. They're 45% of the fixed object fatalities. So we really want to focus on them. Um, and so when we look at the statistics there, again, like you might expect, two-thirds occur in rural areas, but one-third occur in urban areas. And it's not necessarily a speed issue. Now, it is a car issue, as you can see, about two-thirds with cars. But posted speed of 50 and above is about half, and posted speed less than 50 is about half. So low speed is not necessarily a guarantee with trees, okay? If they're in the wrong place, even a relatively low speed can lead to a fatality. And of course, as you'd expect, curbs. And again, a third of them occur in urban areas. So some simulated crash tests, and we will revisit this next week when we talk about some of the crash safety things we can do. But notice what happens, and we've got three speeds. It was done in Europe, so the speeds are 30, 43, and 55 if you convert them to miles per hour. Sweden, if I remember correctly. Notice what happens in the penetration of the vehicle after it hits the tree. And the reason trees are so deadly is because they're almost ductile when you hit them if they're big enough, and it can penetrate deeply into the vehicle itself. And if you hit it at 55 miles an hour, you can see the penetration. It's well into the driver's seat. My first boss when I worked at Yates County before I came to the LTAP Center, the local roads program, I was the deputy over in Yates. My boss, who was the highway superintendent, once fell asleep and literally drove through a tree. Luckily, in his case, it was the right side, and he cut the car in half, and he walked away. 2 feet to the right, he's not here with us. So that's how dangerous trees are. So let me just ask, we can get you all working a little bit here. Have you ever been involved in a roadway departure crash? And you can check all four of these. A head-on, it could even just be a side swipe, a rollover, somewhere time you left the traveled way, or you struck a fixed object, and you can include all four. If you just left and ran into a snowbank, which is what I would be checking, you can check that. Okay, so let's see which ones you've got here. Actually, I guess I have a head-on too, actually, now that I think about it. And again, if you can't do it, you can put it into the pod, and then I'm going to show everybody's responses, and let's see what y'all came up with. Okay. So we have three folks who've said they've been involved in the head-on. Nobody in a rollover. Well, that's good. That's good. 13 of you. Okay. So it's over a quarter of you have been involved in leaving the traveled way, and 8 of you have struck a fixed object. Okay. So that's good. And it could be lots of different factors. In my case, the one time I left the traveled way was on a slippery day. I didn't know it at the time, though. It was black ice. Best I could do was avoid hitting that fixed object, which is just a signpost, but still, I didn't want to take the risk. Okay? So, again, these happen, and if I was to include your family or friends, I bet this number would go way up. So think about that. What have you had? What have you been involved with? Okay? And how many close calls have you had? So that's what we're trying to do. We want to get that down to a much lower number. And it's good to see that not too many of you have been involved in such crashes. Okay. Now, one of the resources I definitely want you to go back and look at is the New York State Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. Yes, the call for funds is already out and people have put their monies and things like that in. There's still a lot of really good information there. So I would advise you to go back and look at that and go look at the appendices. And so my first time to do this, hands up. How many of you, raise your hand if you've actually read or at least opened up the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan from New York State? Raise your hand. Let's see how many of you. Just a few of you. Again, whether you're with the state or a consulting firm, if you're dealing with roadway departure information, make sure this is when you open. There's some good information. There's a lot of good statistics, especially in the appendices of what's happening in New York State. And when we talk about risk factors, we actually come back to the fact that there's already risk factors developed. You don't have to develop them. You can use the ones that are in the appendices of the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. So, okay. Now, we're going to focus our efforts to start with. We're focusing on what are called KIA crashes. And just before I go too far here, let me get my pen working here. There we go. You may see KA. You may see KI little a. I've also seen K little a, and I've even seen a little k little a. They all mean the same thing. Okay? K means a fatality, killed, sadly. I is for injury, and injuries come in three flavors, A, B, and C. Okay? A C injury is they didn't even go to the hospital, or at least they said they didn't even go to the hospital. That's all the people can record. A B is they had to go to the hospital, but it's something pretty minor. An A injury is severe. It's the kind of life-changing injuries that we really want to avoid. These are, long-term concussions, loss of limb, major breaks that take months and months to recover from. Okay? The kind of things you probably would have seen if you'd hit those trees that we saw in the video just a little bit before. Okay, those are ones we want to focus on. And here in New York State, again, this is from the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan data, you can see that if we just look at fatalities that are roadway departure related, maybe we're not too bad. But if you start adding in those serious injuries that change people's lives, that's not great. In 2024, there were over 2,200 of them. Okay, and some would go, hey, the number's coming down. A little bit of a dip in 2024. There's lots of other reasons it could have dipped. So let's watch this long term. Again, we'd like that number to be as close to zero as absolutely possible. Okay. That's really what we're going to focus on because of those life-changing things. So why would you say there's a focus on the KIA or KA or little k, little a crashes? What would be your explanation if somebody asked you, why don't you get rid of all crashes? How would you reply to that? So you can put those in to the poll form. Let's see what y'all think. Why do both NISDOT and FHWA want to focus on the KA crashes? Yep, that's a priority issue. Absolutely. We have to prioritize something. And yes, if you minimize the KIA type crashes, you are going to minimize some of the others. Okay. And yes, I've also seen KSI. Yes, good point. Not as often as you used to, but yeah. They're more expensive. They cost more for both society and for the people involved. Yeah. Okay. And if you've got limited resources, yeah, you want to focus where you're going to get the most bang for the buck. And like it or not, we can't predict against everything. We got to focus on something. It's economics. It's also a case of what we're willing to trade. If you asked me tomorrow, I could have zero fatalities and zero injuries, but everybody in the state would have at least one property damage accident once every 5 years. I hate to say it, I'd take the property damage accident. I'd be willing to have a little bit of fender benders to have people not have their lives uprooted and changed because of a severe crash. Okay? Um, so again, I'm going to ask you to raise your hand. How many of you know somebody who has been involved in a KA, KIA, KSI type crash? Raise your hand if you know somebody personally who's been involved in a crash that they were either killed or seriously injured to the point their life was changed. Let's see how many of you raise your hand. Yeah, it's starting to grow. You think about it, most of you probably know somebody. You're not checking it possibly. Okay. I played hockey with the guy who was involved in that limousine crash a decade ago. Um, Played with him the night before. Um, we've all known somebody if you start thinking about it. And if you don't, you're very, very fortunate. Okay. 40,000 people a year killed and over 100,000 seriously injured every single year. So the focus is, the reason we're focused on that is the cost and the long-term consequences of these type of crashes. And so we're going to focus on roadway departures because, again, it's the highest percentage. But I know the state is working on an intersection improvement plan, and we'll see how things go from there. But here's the concept. It's a circle and it keeps repeating. So first, we want to keep the vehicle on the roadway. If you keep them in their lane, they don't cross over, you're not going to have a crash, or at least not a roadway departure crash. That's good. Then if they do leave the roadway, or they start to cross over the center line, you reduce the potential for the crash by either redirecting them back or making sure there's nothing that if they hit something that's going to be that severe. Okay, so a common thing there is having a good clear zone. And then finally, they might hit something, but if they hit it and it breaks away, we minimize that severity of the crash. And this is a cycle because we're going to keep looking. Because as we get better and better getting rid of the certain locations that have problems, we're going to focus on other locations as well. And that's the roadway departure concept. Long before we put up rail, we want to think about trying to keep them in their lane. And that we can do that. We don't even need the rail. But that's not always going to be possible. So let's focus on a few thoughts here. First off, keeping the vehicle on the road. That means good signage, good traffic lines, good friction, okay? Things like that that keep them where they belong, okay? Reducing the potential for a crash. If they leave the roadway, is the slope steep? Is there a shoulder? Or, this is a very common problem, at least to some of the most severe crashes, they run off the road, there's a bit of a rut, and they decide they have to get back on the roadway, and instead of coming back nice and smooth, they lose control. And this could have led to a fatality or a very serious crash had there been somebody coming in the other direction. It wasn't a test case. Okay? And a lot of us have ridden off the roadway, and what do? I mean, you're supposed to slow down and then come back up slowly, but people don't always do that. So we will come back to the human factors issue a bit. Okay? So we want to keep people on the road, but reduce the potential if they do leave the roadway or the lane. Okay? And then finally, minimize the severity of the crash. Okay? If they are going to hit something, we want them to hit something that causes at most property damage only. This particular case, this tree is well inside the deflection distance of that rail system. Okay? We noticed this on a field visit. The tree was taken down, and less than 2 weeks later, the rail was hit. And the deflection distance would have been enough to actually direct the vehicle into the tree, would have actually made it worse. And we want to minimize the severity. Now, we have a note in the Q&A, and again, please add your questions. I want your questions. And it says, did New York State use the FHWA safety edge at the edge of the pavement and curbless sections? And the answer is yes, it's in the state standards, and we will be talking about the safety edge as one of the proven countermeasures, both today and next Thursday. And safety edge is definitely something that I would think about, and we'll talk about that quite a bit, because it's one of my favorite things that not enough of us are doing yet. Okay. Now, when I was in school, I learned the 3 E's. And then when I got out and was working in Yates County, it became the 4 E's. And at one point, I've even seen as many as 6 or 7 E's. I think we just like adding acronyms. You can come up with bad acronyms if you want. But the idea of the 4 E's were we're going to focus on things to make us safer. So we're going to focus on educating both the engineers, the public, the highway crews. We're going to educate people because we know an educated workforce is going to be better and improve safety. We're going to focus on the engineering of the roadway, okay? We can engineer some things and make them safer. We can make sure there's enforcement. We're going to have some enforcement. Those are the 3 E's I learned in college. And then the 4th E, the one that most people agree upon, is the emergency response, i.e. the golden hour. If you can get to someone within the hour after the crash to proper high quality medical care, the chances of them surviving go way up. Okay? And I know people who've been involved in crashes where without good intervention, they would have had a problem. But let me just ask you this. Raise your hand if you, we got a couple already raised. Let me lower them all. Hang on. Yep. Magically, I love it. Thank you, Jody and Amanda. How many of you are within 1 hour of a high quality trauma hospital? It's not just a local hospital. A lot of you are probably within an hour. I'm talking about one that would be for high level trauma. How many of you are within an hour? If you don't raise your hand, it means you're more than an hour away. How many of you are within? Okay. Not even half of you. I'm just outside an hour here in Ithaca. We have a local hospital, but if it was a high level brain injury, something that could lead to an amputation, I'd have to go to Sayre or Syracuse. Okay. That golden hour makes a huge difference, and we know that. And the idea is we want to get people safe. The problem with the 4Es, what happened over time, and again, it's just these things happen. We got sort of siloed. The engineers did their thing over here. We did education. We did driver's ed, but we didn't worry about all this interaction. And yet we know there's an interaction. Okay. For instance, having police trained to do short-term EMS work can make a big difference. To make sure the roadway is engineered in such a way that maybe it's self-enforcing, and making sure the public has education about what can and cannot be done, and why we don't put up mailboxes like that one in the upper right. It looks nice, but boy, talk about a hammer. So the idea is we're using something called the Safe Systems approach. Now, I cleaned up their logo slightly, had a lot of text on it. Okay, so this is my modified version from FHWA. But essentially, if you think about it, it's got safe road users, it's got safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, and safe enforcement. I don't think that's the term they use. The term they use is post-crash care. Okay, need an S. We need an S. But the idea is towards zero deaths. That's where we want to go if we can. The concept behind this, the catchphrase I like is one mistake should not lead to a serious injury or fatality. That's really the goal that we've got here. So if we look at all of this combined, the safe road user, that's still going to require some education. But that means everybody needs to be involved in the education process. Okay? Safer roads, yeah, we can engineer some things, but we can't engineer everything. But we definitely need to be involved in that process, whether we're planners or engineers or people actually doing the maintenance work. We've got to be involved in that process for it to work. And in terms of safe speeds, what is a safe speed? Well, it's more than zero. We definitely need to use those roadways, but we need to be using those roadways in such a way that it makes sense and be reasonable about it. Okay? Uh, 50 miles an hour in the middle of a city is not a safe speed, certainly for anybody who's not inside of a car. And even inside of a car, it's pretty dangerous. So what's a safe speed? How do we balance the need to get from point A to point B with what we can and cannot do with the money that we've got? And of course, post-crash care is still there, that golden hour. And we do talk about the vehicles. Now, this is a Corvair, which was unsafe at any speed, according to Ralph Nader. But really, when you think about it, the idea of the safe systems is to not silo. We purposely want to break that silo. We don't want to just focus on the engineering. We want to think about the user. We want to think about the enforcement. And think about, do we do something different if we're not near a hospital? Okay? If we can, we want redundancy. Okay? So imagine a situation where somebody is going too fast for some reason, so they're not safe speed. Their vehicle has some issue with it. Maybe the brakes went. Maybe the user's a little bit out of it for some reason. Could be alcohol, could be drugs, could be distracted driving. They're on their cell phone. All of those things could lead to a crash. But if the roadway itself isn't dangerous, maybe they still have no problem. Okay? And even if they do have a crash, can we get to them and get them post-crash care? And we're going to show a couple of examples of that, which I think you'll enjoy. But let's start with one, and we're going to go back to this one I showed you earlier of the run off the road crash. And this is a good example of redundancy, okay? So here's our driver going off the roadway, okay? So they just went off the roadway, right? Now think about it. Let's go back to our slide. Were they a safe road user? Well, actually, you're going to see in a minute what happened. No, they weren't a safe road user. Okay. The vehicle was pretty safe. They were strapped in. They had on their seatbelts. The two kids in the car had the proper seatbelt slash car seats. But, you know, that wasn't enough. The speed, way too high. We'll see how that worked in a minute. But the road did its job. Now, it's an interstate, I know. But notice, we're going to show the video again. Watch what happens when they run off the road. They hit a signpost, a big one, for an exit. And it does its job. And they walked away. That redundancy helped make sure this went from being a tragedy to just a minor property damage only crash. Okay? So what are the components? I know, I just showed you the slide, so we're going to see how y'all do. What are the components of the safe system approach? What are the 5 things we care about? Roadway, safe, yep. Safe users, safe speeds, post-crash care, drivers. Yeah, very good. And the word safe shows up a lot, as you would expect. Yep, nice job. And yeah, it's not in the 5 components, but that redundancy is really something we need to be thinking about, that we're not siloing things. We're looking at everything combined. And yes, it's called the Swiss cheese model for a reason. We can stop that Swiss cheese holes from lining up. We might eliminate things. So yeah, with safe road users, safe roads, safe speeds, post-crash care, and safe vehicles. It's really the 4 E's plus looking at the vehicle, but making sure we don't get in a situation where they get siloed. Okay? So, what do I want to do for our last 15 minutes in this first session? Well, 12. Um, why do vehicles leave the roadway? Well, they leave the roadway for several reasons. It could be the roadway condition. It could be a collision avoidance problem, like a dead deer, not dead deer, almost dead deer runs out in front of them, a vehicle component failure, or driver error. Those are the most common 4 things. Now, we can't always do much about collision avoidance, especially with wildlife. There are some things we can do, but not a lot. Um, but there are things we can certainly do with the roadway, the vehicle, and the driver. Now, you've probably seen a version of this particular chart I'm going to show you, a Venn diagram that talks about crash factors. And if we look at the highway, the vehicle, and the human factors, you've seen this Venn diagram in different formats. Now, I'm going to show you the Venn diagram, but I want you to please understand it has a serious fatal flaw. Okay? Now, if we look at the percentage of crashes that occur when there's a vehicle problem, a highway problem, or a human factors problem, we can make a Venn diagram, or I did it as a pie chart. So 3% of the time, only 3%, it's actually pretty good. Only 3% of the time is it just a highway problem. The driver was doing everything they're supposed to do, and there's something wrong with the highway. It was too slippery, didn't have the proper super, and it led to a crash that was fatal. About a quarter of the time, a little over, 28% of the time, um, the human was part of the equation. So maybe the road was a little too slippery, but they were going a little too fast for conditions. Okay? Almost 60% of the time, it's just the human. We did our job as engineers, at least according to the standards, and that's the key why this has got an issue. But there still was a crash. About 6% of the time, it might have been the vehicle. Maybe their tires were bald and they were going too fast. Only 3% of the time is it the vehicle itself. And then, of course, the vehicle on the highway might have an issue as well. And then there's a small percentage, about 3%, that sort of everything gets involved. And so if we add all these numbers up, the vehicle is involved only about 13% of the time, the highway just about a third, and the human factors is over 90%. 90% of the time, there are human factors. And there are people who will then go, well, there's nothing we can do. It's the humans. There's absolutely something we can do. Okay? We can think about the human factor issue when we're developing our plans for improving safety. These numbers are based upon the idea that the highway met the standards, but that's the minimum standards. There may be other things we can do. Think about getting involved. That video we saw of the lady who had the problem, well, if you think about it, that's a driver error video. Okay? That's a human factors problem. So let's watch the whole video and see what happens. And remember, this one would be classified as only a human factors problem. 100% human factor. Okay? And this time I think I have the sound on. I don't know if you can hear it. Okay, there's no sound, so I'll tell you what the sound says. It's a disoriented driver who's just driving down the road, and you can see what he says there. I won't repeat that. She was going too fast, she was going too slow, and there it is. There's the lady. She was diabetic. She didn't realize her blood sugar had dropped seriously low, and she started literally falling asleep. And when you fall asleep, sometimes you push down, and she pushed down on the gas pedal and went faster and faster and ran off the roadway. So that's 100% considered a human factors crash. And yet, the roadway did its job. The roadway was designed in such a way that they survived. So yeah, it was a human factors crash, but it wasn't a fatality because the human factors were not the primary reason for the incident. Yes, the human factor was why we had the crash, but the severity of it was reduced by us doing our job. And we can actually do that quite often. There are things we can do to reduce the severity if the crash does occur, or things we can do that go above and beyond the quote unquote standard to keep people in their lane and to reduce the chance of a crash occurring. So yes, that's human factors problem, but in reality, it was a success. Okay. So we can do things, we can deal with that redundancy because we had a safe road, even though there were other issues, it didn't lead to a serious problem. Okay. So the Swiss cheese model does work. We can do a lot more, and a lot of those human factors only crashes, there are things we can do. Okay. And we'll come back to this a few times. Now, in terms of the risk factors themselves, there's lots of risk factors. If you read through the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan from New York State, they have a list of the most common risk factors that they've already done the analysis for, especially on the state roads. So you can look at, for instance, major collectors, minor collectors, arterials, things like that. We won't have time to go through all of them, but just as an example, this is the major collectors. They found that posted speeds of 50 to 55 tend to be a higher risk factor. Makes sense. High speed. Traffic volumes. The lower traffic volumes tended to have more problems. If you start thinking about that, makes sense. We probably just didn't make them quite as wide in terms of the roadway, or maybe there's some little less clear zone. Okay. Curve radius that's sharp. That makes sense. Okay. We'll come back and revisit that particular one. And then a narrow shoulder. They've already developed these risk factors, so you can just read through there and pick them out for your particular type of roadway and can really help. But let's just ask you, just in the back of your head, what are some common risk factors on your roads and streets? If you were just going to make a list, what would you put down? We'll put a Wordle together here. What are some common risk factors on your roads and streets? And again, if you can't access the poll, you can throw it in the Q&A. The width on the shoulder, trees, ramps that are short. Yep. Okay. Somebody put over into the Q&A speed. Yep. Speed is absolutely an issue. Okay. That's a risk factor. Blind corners, polishing of the stone or a slippery surface. Yeah, could be an issue. Okay. Potholes, people being distracted. Okay. You can make a list. In fact, it's a good idea. You're making one now. Do it with a team. And you probably come pretty close. And then we recommend you go out and you get some data to confirm these things and find out whether something is really critical or not. It may or may not be. Um, when we've looked at roadway departure plans, local road safety plans that have been out there, there are some common issues, and yes, aggressive driving is part of it. Um, Speed is definitely an issue. Traffic volume is an issue, especially from an exposure standpoint. Lane width, of course, makes a huge difference. Is there a shoulder? What is that width of that shoulder? What is the clear zone? Okay. What do we want for a clear zone? What are the trees? Where are the trees? Curves and their associated radius. Okay. Uh, is the super elevation proper on the curve? This can be especially a problem in intersections where we're trying to balance three things at the same time. The curve, the intersection not being too harsh, and we want sight distance too. So that can all lead to fun. And are there previous crashes? Now, some would argue that's not a risk factor. Um, I will tell you right now, you should probably always include it as a communication tool with the public, but think about those common risk factors, and we'll revisit this idea here in just a minute. Now, we're going to end our last little 5 minutes here, take our break here at the bottom of the hour, uh, talking about something called crash modification factors. These come from something called the Highway Safety Manual, okay? And the CMF Clearinghouse, which we'll look at here in just a second. We're actually going to open it, but just to show you the website. You may have heard the term accident modification factors. It's an older term. It's the same thing. Again, we just changed from accident to crash. So crash modification factors account for the difference between the old and the new geometry. They use other terms like the base geometry and stuff like that, but essentially they've calculated out the math behind what happens if you do X, Y, and Z. Widen the shoulder, flatten the slope, put up rail, things like that. These are modification factors. And the cool thing is there's estimates for the individual effects, and then there are formulas if you really want to get into it that allow you to combine things together. There's some techniques involved in that, but a lot of times we just start with a simple single improvement and see what happens. And then if the number is less than 1, you've lowered the crash frequency. If the number is greater than 1, you've increased the crash frequency. Okay? So how does this work? Well, if you have a crash modification factor, you multiply that times the time you're looking at, which is typically 1 year, but could be multiple years, like 5 or 10, times the crash rate, which is the current rate of crashes per year, you're going to get the new crash rate. So you can compare the old to the new. Okay? So raise your hand if you think a CMF of 1.1 is good. Raise your hand if you think CMF of 1.1 is good. Please don't raise your hand. Please. Nobody raise your hand. That's good. Yay. Except there's an asterisk there. Again, the crash modification factors can look at just fatal and serious injury crashes. They can look at specific types like roadway departure crashes. They can also look at all crash types. And if you got a CMF of 1.2 for all crash types, but your CMF for fatal or serious was 0.5, I'd take that in a heartbeat. So yeah, normally it's not good, but what are we trading? What are we trying to do? So it's a caveat. No in general, but there might be exceptions when you look at specifics, and the clearinghouse does have that. So you may also hear the term crash reduction factor, which is a percent reduction that might be expected. It's not different. It's just the crash modification factor subtracted from 1. Okay? So therefore, if it's a positive number, crashes go up. If it's a negative number, crashes go down. And the message I want you to take home here is make sure you look at the reports. There's a thing called the CMF Clearinghouse. It's in your reference list. It's available to you in the handout. It's also just search cmfclearinghouse.org. If you don't have time to read the report, do me a favor. Do not use these without reading the report. And if you have to do them in a pinch, make sure you look at the ones that have high star values, which means 4 or 5 stars. Don't look at lower than that. Okay? Absolutely want to look at the ones with high value. Okay? Because there's an error involved. And what we're going to do is, I'm a firm believer the mind can absorb what the can endure. We're at the bottom of the hour. We'll come back from this. We'll show you why that's actually pretty important, okay? Why it's really important to choose the good CMF, okay? Now, before I lose my spot, I'm on slide 66, so I want to go to slide 67 when we come back. I'm going to take a break from everybody, okay? So we will come back at, let's see, we're going to come back at quarter of, and it will be 9:45. And again, if you have any questions, this is open. You can put your questions in. We'll try to get them answered. See you guys and ladies and everybody in about 15 minutes. I see we have a couple of questions in the Q&A. I'll get back to both of them a little bit, but the quick answer is in terms of tree studies, there are things, but there's nothing in the clearinghouse. We might do a little bit of time in the clearinghouse if we have it later today. And in terms of rail, very good question about offset, and we'll talk about that as well. But remember, rail in of itself is considered a fixed object, so that might help answer that. But we'll definitely leave those active, and we'll come back to them and try to get you an answer for those things as well. Okay, so let's go back to our slide we were talking about in terms of error and the clearinghouse and stuff like that. And again, I'll come back to the clearinghouse a little bit. I think we have time toward the end of this next session here. But here's the reason why want to make sure you understand what those factors mean and understand how to use them. Remember, there's something called standard error that's usually available in the higher quality studies. Because the crash rate is, time times the CMF, the crash modification factor. But there's an error involved, and that range comes back to that old statistical curve, that Gaussian curve you've talked about. And yeah, it may not be perfectly Gaussian, but it's close enough. And we just want to make sure we understand there's an error involved. None of these things are perfect, okay? So the most common thing you see, and if they never say it, by the way, in all the studies, whether it's a poll of political people or they're talking about opinions about tomato soup, they don't say it, they're assuming 95%. So what we've got is a little bit of a tail at each end we can ignore, okay? Yeah, we could get a weird situation, but most of the time we're okay with that. And so the technical way you would do that is you do something called the normal statistic or Z statistic, and the value at the 95th percentile is a multiplier of 1.96. Gotta get my calculator out. But if I just round that to 2, it's a little conservative, and it's something I can probably do in my head. So what does that mean? Well, the range then becomes the crash modification factor plus 2 times that standard error for the CMF value. So the crash rate then has a range to it. There's the middle and there's the range. To illustrate this, let me just show you an example of something that's replacing heavy post with weak. When we talk about rail systems later on, we'll definitely talk about the fact you'd like to use the lightest rail system possible that will do the job. And as a crash modification factor, it's pretty high. And these, remember, for serious and fatal crashes. Okay, we're still going to get some crashes, but we reduce the severity of them. So the current rate is 5 crashes per year at this particular location of rail. And so what would be the expected number of crashes over 5 years? Well, obviously, if 5 times 5, without any modification, the value is going to be 25. 5 times 5. But if we apply the CMF, is 5 times 5 times 0.68, or only 17 crashes. But remember, there's an error involved, and that error is 5 times 5 times 2, which technically 1.96, times 0.1, okay, and I put an extra asterisk in there, I'm not sure why. And that range plus or minus 5. So if we were to look at this, it's a range of 12 to 22 crashes. So definitely an improvement, may not be all the way down to 17, but it's still definitely an improvement and probably worth it from a return on investment standpoint, even just reducing a few serious crashes. Now, this pretty obvious one, but there are lots of studies. They put all the studies up there in the Crash Modification Clearinghouse. And so in this case, flatten the slope and remove the rail has a crash modification factor. It's even better, 0.58. But look at the error. The error is 5.75 or 5.8 or 0.58 if you look at it. It's almost the same. And so if you expected 25 per year, by the time we did the math, we still get less crashes. In fact, in this case, 15, but the error is plus or minus 29. It is possible it could go up in terms of serious and fatal crashes. Why do you think that might be? I mean, just think about that. What could happen? Hey, I flatten the slope and I remove the rail. That should make it safer. But what's at the bottom of the slope? Did you flatten the slope enough? Is it a situation where it's on the outside of a curve and that flat slope isn't quite as beneficial as you might think? And so that's why I want you to, if you're looking at the CMF clearinghouse, you can use them, and I'll show you some examples of some later on, but just be aware of the fact there might be an error. And if you don't have time to read the report, I understand that. It's something you want to make sure of. And by the way, I did check. I do have to make a small caveat. I just checked. I wouldn't look this particular one up. Well, since someone asked about guide rail, they've now given this report a 3rd star. It's still not one I would use because the error is so high. Remember, 4 or 5 stars only, okay? So let's just do a quick review of what we've got. I won't make you type this in, but just think about defining a roadway departure crash. Put that answer in your head. And the answer you should have had is a crash in which a vehicle crosses an edge line, a center line, or otherwise leaves the traveled way, i.e. uncontrolled changing lanes. Those lead to bad crashes. That's why it's a severe thing we care about. And what type of crashes are included in this? Okay. Well, again, pretty much any crash where you leave a lane. That includes your head-ons, your rollovers, your trees, your poles, your barriers, your other fixed, your other roadside. Okay. Now this one I am going to make you do a poll. What's the most deadly fixed object? What's the one that's got that 19%? Is it guide rail, utility poles, trees, embankments, or none of the above? Yeah, that's a pretty easy one. But remember, rail, utility poles, and embankments are considered deadly. It could be objects. Maybe not a fixed object because the embankment, but the point is there are risks, and we have to think about balancing those up, okay? Because it's trees by far. About 45% of all the crashes that occur when you hit a deadly fixed object are because you hit a tree or a big shrub. Again, I've got these 2 questions here that we've got. We will look at those questions, okay? Even the ones that aren't showing, I'll pull them back out and get those questions back out, and we'll look at them in terms of studies, in terms of rail, okay? So keep adding your questions in, and we'll go from there. Now, how do we get to safety? I mean, how do we get from, we know there's an issue, we know there's some concerns, how do we get to where we'd like to be? Okay? Well, what I want to do is I want you to sort of be able to list some possible strategies, overall implementation strategies that you could take. And I really want you to understand the concept of what's known as the systemic safety approach. And then at the same time, compare some methods for deploying the different countermeasures that are available, which we'll talk about both in the last hour today and all day next Thursday. Well, all morning. Okay. So the implementation strategies really come down to primarily 3 focus areas that we look at. Implementation. There's a systematic, a site-specific, and a systemic. And yes, it's a lot of S's, and it can get difficult to compare them apart. And then if you bring them all together, comprehensive is really the safe systems approach, where we look at everything. So we have some systematic or overall sections. We have some site-specific hotspot analysis, more traditional. We can do a systemic based on risk, and then make sure we include the enforcement, the education. We break down all of those silos. Okay, so I want you to understand that. We're going to walk through these 4 little boxes. together, and we'll ask some questions as we go along. So to start with the comprehensive, which again is really the idea behind the safe systems approach. And in this case, the text around the little chart is something that I want to talk about. And that is that we don't want death or serious injury. We really don't want that. One mistake should not lead to a serious injury or fatality. So we have to have redundancy. We have to think about the fact that humans make mistakes. We all make mistakes. We just don't want that one mistake to lead to a problem. And we have to be proactive about things. And everybody is responsible. Okay. So that means we need to include enforcement. We need to include education. And we have to educate people beyond just getting their driver's license. We have to educate other activities and things like that. So it's a safe systems overall approach. Okay. And we can't just do one of these things. We really need to be doing all of them. And which is the highest priority? Well, the answer is yes. There are times when it's education. There's times when it's going to be engineering. There's times when it's going to be the vehicles. And we are going to make mistakes, but hopefully those mistakes lead at most to a property damage only crash. Now, let's look at those three that were at the top. Okay. The first one is called systematic. Sometimes people call this a system-wide approach, okay? And so what you do is you go and you find effective system-wide approaches, and eventually you may turn those into policies and standards, okay? So some people will even call this a policy-based approach, where we're going to have a systematic or system-wide or overall network analysis. It's a long-term process, but it can actually be very, very effective in the short term too. But the idea is you're looking long-term and you're changing how we do things. It changes your standards, your operating procedures, and your policies. It will outlast almost any other approach that you've got out there. Now, this is the example that I usually give to people when you're talking about this is someone's already raised this question in the Q&A, and that's the idea of the safety edge for paving, okay? Where you actually put a wedge on the outside edge of the pavement to make things safer. We will definitely talk about that particular application because it's one that, yes, it's in the state standards, but it ought to be in everybody's standards. And we'll talk about why it's a good idea. That the idea would be to incorporate or adopt a policy to incorporate this in all your paving projects, unless, of course, you have curbs. Okay, but anything that doesn't have a curb approach, you do a safety edge. So when it comes to a systematic or system-wide plan, okay, you would not just apply it on some things, you'd apply it everywhere. It's not based on crash history. It's not based upon except, anything except maybe road type. Maybe you have a slightly different standard for your arterials and your collectors versus your locals, and we'll come back to that in a little bit. But it's not based on crash history. It's based upon, we just do this as we're doing either other things or by themselves, okay? Now, it may take years to implement in some cases. In other cases, it might be faster or something that you're doing on an annual basis, but it's a proactive approach to look at your entire system, okay? So, time for a poll regarding the systematic or system-wide approach. Name a policy, type in a policy implemented by your agency. I'll let you do that for about 20 seconds before I start showing the results. Name a policy implemented by your agency. Okay, give you time to put a few in. Let's come down here and start looking at your responses. Okay, wrong way signs on on-ramps. Yep. Could be something at the shall in the manual of uniform traffic control devices, but yeah, a policy. Okay, vision zero, we want to get 0 deaths. Grade separated bike paths. Using heavy post blockouts above the traffic volumes above a certain amount. Okay, we can talk, and we'll talk about that when we talk about reflective edge lines. Okay, 6-inch edge lines on a rural road. Yeah, versus 4-inch, which is the standard. Okay, and we will talk about that actually as an example of something that actually has a pretty good crash modification factor to it. Okay, rumble strips, okay? So these are policies that you might implement in your particular agency. So I'll let you keep typing those in, but let me just ask, what is the risk of creating a policy or standard operating procedure? Can somebody give me in the Q&A, throw me in the Q&A, in this case we won't do a poll, we'll do it in the Q&A. Can you give me a reason why that's actually can be risky? What's the risk of creating a policy or standard operating procedure? A system-wide or systematic approach. Give me an example, either an example of a policy which led to problems or why it's risky. It could cause legal issues if not followed. Absolutely. That's one of the biggest issues. Once you put it in writing, you got to do it. And sometimes a bad policy can be worse than no policy at all. Um, and it may not apply universally. There may be times when it doesn't fit. And so if you write a policy and then require people to follow it, you may put them into a corner that's not a good corner. So be careful in what the MUTCD would call shalls. I'm not saying they're not a good idea. They're a great idea. But you want to think about, are there realistic exceptions? Okay. And let's just be honest. A good example was putting in centerline rumble strips. An excellent idea, but applying it too quickly until the road is ready to accept that rumble strip could lead to problems and did lead to problems in some locations. Okay. So something to think about is a good policy is great. A bad policy can actually make things worse because now you follow it and you don't even necessarily know why you followed it. Okay. And you may not get the benefit someone put in the actual cost versus benefit. It may not be realized. Yeah. So there is a risk, but we definitely want to think about implementing certain countermeasures in a systematic or system-wide approach. Okay. Now, the more site-specific, sometimes called traditional, sometimes called hotspots, um, it's something we do need to include in our mix. I'm not advocating at all that we don't look at hotspot analysis. In fact, it's very important that we continue to do so. But realize, if it's all you do, you're going to have a minimal impact statewide. We are not going to solve the problem. We're not going to get towards vision zero if all we do is wait till there's a hotspot, wait till there's crashes. Okay? So what we're doing is we're typically looking for the very high number of crashes. And guess what? They usually occur more at intersections, and we'll talk about why in just a minute. Though there are some particular curves that can be problems. Okay? They're very highly effective. They definitely need to be in your toolkit, but they're typically also fairly high cost solutions. So it's a limited number that you can do in a particular year. Okay? So like for instance, a curve reconstruction, uh, pavement or shoulder widening, which might involve getting right of way in a few cases. Okay? Those are very effective, but they can cost quite a bit of money. Okay? You do need to look at individual sections. You're going to have to do an analysis. We'll talk about data here in a little bit, where you might get some of that data. But from a statewide perspective, it's relatively few improvements. Okay? So in the Q&A, tell me how many, we're going to look at something outside of safety, but just to illustrate the idea, how many road reconstructions, and reconstruction, by the way, means taking out the asphalt, the base, and putting a whole new roadway in. How many reconstructions did you do in the last 5 years? Total brand new, road reconstructions of at least a mile. Did anybody do at least a mile? You did one. Okay. Not too many. I'm not saying we shouldn't do them. We should, but it's usually limited. In fact, probably going to be less than 100 statewide per year if you start looking at it, even counting all the local agencies. Just not going to be a lot. So it may not affect the big picture, the statewide fatalities and serious crashes. But it is something we like to do. We've done a lot. But remember, If you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always gotten. So we need to do hotspot analysis, and we definitely want to focus on the hotspots. But, and this is actually good news in some respects, we've actually done a pretty good job of catching the worst hotspots. There are still a few, and if you look at the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, there's actually some charts and there's some online data that's available, so you can find the hotspots due to analysis that was done in the state system. So there are value in having this approach. Now, I'm going to map crashes in the southern tier. I also have one I could show you from another location. We're going to do another example in a minute, but this is one I've shown before in the southern tier. Fatal crashes in 2012 to 2014. And there are the crashes. I'm going to go back one and highlight it up. Okay. Just think about, do you see a place that needs to be treated? Can you think of a place on this map that would need to be treated? And when we do this in person, we have people, point and we do a circle and stuff like that. And I could do that here. I can get my pen out. Let me get my pen out and pick a color that, let's see, I'm not using blue. I'll do blue. And you might go, well, there's a couple that are close here near Ithaca, and there's a couple that are close here, not too far south of Bainbridge. But every one of those dots, even if they're touching, they're half a mile apart. Now, if we added in the serious injuries, we might start seeing some possible hotspots, but it may not be as many spots as we think. But there's still going to be crashes. So what we want to do is focus on that. So here I've done, this is a series of maps in Humboldt County, California, back in the early 2000s. And they were looking at a sign implementation and striping implementation program. So we're going to look at a few years, and what I'm going to do is take my little pen here, and I'm going to circle on here the crashes over on the right, okay? So there is a crash right there on this one road going north-south. There's another crash, there's two crashes here in 2006. There's another crash up here in 2007. These are the fatals, by the way. It was a bad year. We got two there. They're not actually that close in this case. But I'm going to circle all of them. Okay. And then I think that, yep, that's it. Those are the 4 years. Okay. So we have these crashes, and there's a couple that look relatively close, but if you actually look real closely at them, you'll actually see they're not that close to each other. Even the two that are overlapping are, again, not in exactly the same curve. They're not quite as close as we might think. In fact, when you look at the map, you're going, why weren't there any fatals in certain locations? Well, sometimes people know the place is risky and they don't go as fast. Or maybe it's well signed. I don't know. But the crashes were occurring in random locations along this stretch of highway before they put in their signs. But if you look at crash types across the entire state of California, okay, you can actually start to notice certain types of crashes are really common. Okay, so in 2005, we've got a lot of, they hit a fixed object crashes, by far the biggest. By far the biggest. By far the biggest. All 4 years, fixed object hits for fatal crashes was the biggest. And then if you looked at second place, broad swipe and head-on combined, which would be the ones where we cross over the center line, are going to be 2, 3, or 4. And then we also have some vehicle and pedestrian. So I'll just circle all those. So if you were going to focus your efforts, you want to put your effort where you've got the highest percentages. And notice, by the way, if I add the overturns into the pile, which aren't quite as high in a lot of cases, you'll actually see that except for those vehicle pedestrian ones, they're all roadway departure related. In fact, if we add it up, overturns are 10 to 12, head-ons 10 to 12, broadside 16 to 19, and hit objects 27 to 29%. the locations tended to not be in the same place. They varied quite a bit. But the numbers were pretty consistent, percentage-wise and total-wise. So this is the idea behind systemic safety, is we're getting a randomness to it to some extent. Not completely, but to a limited extent. And when there's a higher chance of a probability of a crash, higher risk, we will do something. So let me illustrate this with, I'm going to call it the virtual dice rolls. We do this in person, we'll actually give people a piece of a die. But what we're going to do is we're going to do this. We're going to do a virtual die roll, and I'm going to pull out my little computer here. We call that a cell phone these days. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to put in a random number. Oh, my random number generator was being persnickety. And generate. Okay, so everybody, choose a number. I've already chosen it. Choose a number between 20 and 25. Put it in your head, write it down, whatever you want to do to keep it so you don't forget it. Okay? Now, choose a vowel, A, E, I, O, U, and Y. So, everybody got that in your head? You got that? Okay. So our two chosen random dice rolls are 24 and 0. Raise your hand if you got 24 and 0. Raise your hand if you got 24 and 0. Nobody raised their hand. So we're chasing, if we were chasing and fixing problems, we might not have actually fixed anybody's problems at all. Okay, I'm going to clear all those things on screen. We're going to do this again. Everybody first choose a number between 20 and 25. Okay. And now choose the vowel again. Pick a random vowel, pick your favorite, whatever you want to do. And this time it's 22 O again, interestingly enough. Raise your hand if you got 22 and O. 1. The idea here is crash locations tend to be within, especially in combating roadway departures, a bit random. Yeah, there's some common factors, but there are enough of those common factors that are a bit random, but the types themselves are pretty predictable. And so what we can do is start looking for commonalities, some crash factors that tend to lead to the more serious and fatal crashes. Okay? And so that's what we're going to try to do and focus on where can we get the most bang for the buck. Okay? What's the common factors that are occurring? Fixed objects next to the roadway, lack of shoulders, sharp corners, are those common factors. Okay? And guess what? Here's what we did earlier. We made a common risk factors for your roads and streets. If you start looking at your own system, I bet you start seeing where you've got shoulder problems, where you've got curve problems, where you've got narrow right-of-way, narrow clear zones, drop-offs. These are the common factors. And here's the really cool part about it. How many of you have ever been in a meeting, you're in a public hearing working on something, especially if it's safety related, and somebody gets up and says, do we have to wait till somebody dies before we fix the problem or gets injured before we fix the problem? Well, in the case of systemic safety, the answer is we can focus on those critical locations before the crash occurs because we can take advantage of the fact that they're occurring a bit randomly, but the types, what's being hit, what kind of event is occurring is something that has some risks to it. And so what we do is we use a risk-based approach and we correlate it with those crash types. We take advantage of that randomness, that statistics. Okay? So what do? We're going to fix then either the most common crashes or those that are overrepresented. A lot of times both. If we can do it, both is actually a good place to start. But look for the common or overrepresented crashes and then apply the systemic countermeasures, looking at the worst places, the places that have the most risk. Now, this is a study that was done by New York State DOT, looking at curve radii and the crash risk factor, okay? So these are the serious and fatals, and we're going to look first at the number of curves in terms of percentage of curves in the system that have a different radius. So if we just look at the number of segments, there are 7% of the curves are 100 to 300 foot radius, 10% are 300 to 500, 6% are 500 to 700, and then 5% are 700 to 1,000. Okay? If everything were equal, we would expect the number of crashes to be 7, 10, 6, and 5. No difference, right? But you and I both know that's not what we're going to see. In fact, here's the cool thing about data. The data shows us that, yep, sharp curves have a higher crash rate. There are more crashes occurring on the sharp curves than on the higher radius curves. In fact, by the time you get up to the 700 to 1,000 foot curves, you're really looking at almost less crashes because the curves have got a nice radius to them. So if we want to do curve improvements, maybe we want to focus on those curves that are in the 100 to 500 foot stretch, where they're a little overrepresented or they're more common, okay? One or both. Now, in terms of where we might focus this, we could develop a risk table. There's more than one way to do a risk table. This is just one example. So what you would do is you'd look at the severity, and then you'd look at the probability and the frequency sort of combined. Now, what's the probability of occurring, i.e. the risk factor, but also the frequency that it might occur because of exposure traffic, okay? So you look at these things together, and they're not always additive, but if it's frequently occurring because of either high probability or high traffic, that's your urgence for fatals. You really want to put your money there. In fact, those probably actually almost are hotspots. In a lot of cases, they are. But then if it's only occurring occasionally, you might look at the places that have a little bit higher risk for fatalities. And if it's unlikely to occur because either the probability is low or the traffic volumes are low, you might not even worry about it. Again, you have to put your money in the most return on investment. So let's go back to this slide we looked at earlier. Okay? If someone were to run off the road into the ditch on the left, that's about 6 feet deep, and it's pretty sharp. Most assuredly, if they were in a car, they'd run up on their top of their car. They'd flip. Okay? The one on the right, if they miss there, they're going to be going tumbling down a 20-foot high embankment. Okay? So raise your hand if you fix the one on the left first. Okay, I got one person raising their hand, two. Okay, I'm going to lower everybody's hands. Actually, Amanda and Jody are going to do that for me. Now raise your hand if you would fix the one on the right first. Yeah, that's what we want to put our money onto. And I can't argue with you if I don't know enough of the facts. That's why facts are so important. Does it make a difference? I'm going to lower everybody's hands again. Does it make a difference if I tell you the traffic volume on the left is 6,000 plus? It's actually about 8,000 these days. And the one on the right has a traffic volume under 50. So let's ask the same question again. How many of you would do the right one first still? If the traffic volume is 8,000 versus 50? Yeah, a lot less. I'm not saying you don't want to do something there, but the exposure is so great on the one on the left, even though it's got a wide shoulder, there's just so much more traffic. It still leads to serious crashes. You might need to do something there first. And you have to think about balancing those. There's no perfect answer. By the way, short term, I would at least delineate the one on the right. Okay. I'm a big fan of delineation on the really low volume system. And we'll come back to that on next Thursday when we're talking about roadway departure things you can do for limited amounts of money. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're developing our plan out. And again, look for the places where there's a higher rate. So you could actually do a chart up that looks at the number of sections versus the number of crashes. And then you could start doing a plot to see where the higher rates were. So you start with the ones that have most of the crashes, and you're going to find out that most of your crashes are occurring on a pretty small portion of the system. Okay? So in this case, they're overrepresented. Head-on and side swipe crashes are occurring. Almost 60% of them are occurring, or about half of them actually are occurring on only about a quarter of the system. Okay? If you put them in rank order, by the way, this is how this chart's done. From a national standpoint, this is another reason why it's such a focus for roadway departures. 44% of the rollover crashes are occurring at curbs. Head-ons, 30% occur actually at curbs, even though they're nowhere near 30% of the segments, especially at the national level. And trees, 45%. So guess what? We want to focus on head-ons, trees, rollovers, the big three in our fatality chart as well. And they're going to be occurring near curbs in a lot of cases. So let's talk about the way you can solve this problem. And this is a proven countermeasure, and yet we're going to talk about it now because it's part of the implementation process. Do you have a local road safety plan? Okay. And the answer could be yes. It could be with another agency or with an MPO. Could be no, could be not sure. You're working on one currently or other. And again, if you type other, just tell me what you meant by that. Okay. Now, we call them local road safety plans, but the reality is it should just be road safety plans because you can have one for the state system as well. Okay. So it's really a road safety plan. And by the way, some of the ones that are out there that are in your reference, the handout, are tribal road safety plans. And they include state roads, county roads, town roads, local roads, just roads. Okay. And so you're not sure, and that's okay. When you get back to your office, if you're with an agency, check. If you're with a consulting firm, check if your local town or county has one. This is one of the best ways to implement those four ideas that we had of systemic, systematic, site-specific, and then an overall comprehensive safe systems approach. Put everything together in a local road safety plan. Okay? And so the idea behind the local road safety plan is really to identify the stakeholders and get to implementing solutions. And so I want to just go through this real quickly to make sure we're all on the same page of what we can do. Okay? Now, the steps, we're going to identify the stakeholders, who should be involved in getting your information. How do you get the data so you can actually figure out what the risk factors are? Because you definitely want a systemic approach in this case, but also look for possible hotspots. Choose proven solutions. You can select almost any solution you want, but there's so many good proven solutions out there. There's no reason to reinvent the wheel to start with, though you may want to tweak them slightly for your own case. And then this is maybe the hardest one. You got to actually implement the solutions. You got to pay for it and you got to put it in the budget. Okay. So let's go through these four steps together. First off, you got to identify the stakeholders. So, who are the stakeholders? So who are the stakeholders for a local road safety plan? Who would you want to have involved to get data from them? You want law enforcement. Yeah, definitely should be involved. Yep, absolutely. I'd have law enforcement be on my list. Highway department, whoever's managing the department, the DOT. Yep. Okay. You want public involvement. Absolutely. Okay. DPW is over in the Q&A. Yeah, same thing. The public, the residents need to be involved. And by the way, a great communication tool is part of a road safety audit process. You can actually get that feedback and maybe everybody starts to realize there are no perfect solutions. Okay. But we don't want perfect to be the enemy of good. So who's involved? Do you want to include the local school? Are they part of the equation? How about local business organization? Probably yes. For developing a local road safety plan, you can have almost as many people as you want. One of the ones that we've highlighted in the handout is from Chemung County, which included the city of Elmira and some of the surrounding towns. And there were like 40 different people involved in the initial meeting. Probably too many for a road safety audit, but for developing a local road safety plan, get lots of input, okay? Brainstorm a little bit, get some ideas, and you get people involved in maybe becoming, again, your advocate, as someone put in there in the advocacy, okay? And if you're an MPO, you definitely want the MPO involved, okay? Then you're going to take that ideas and suggestions and everybody involved, and you're going to start developing a plan, and you're going to go back to those stakeholders to get more advice and ideas, okay? So that's pretty important stuff to keep in mind, okay? So let's look at the risk factors. Remember, what we're looking for are the most common risks, overrepresented crashes, and then if we have them, some hotspots. And we've already developed a list of what we're going to be looking for. We know the answer to this, but now we want to see if it's really, really important. Okay? And by the way, when I did this last time, I got the same answers. Notice you guys just did shoulders, curves, and width of the roadway. And we did it last time, curves, speed, utilities. The idea is you develop these risk factors, you look at actual data, and then you start figuring what are the most common risk factors. You can do weightings if you want. Weighting factors are allowed, but I have to admit, it might lose people. Keep it simple. So in this case, we got our fake road network, and we've got risk factors. Sharp curves seem to be an issue. High speed was an issue. Whether there was a crash is an issue. Downhill grades tended to be a problem, and high number of vehicles per day. Those are the most common risk factors, and you normally would have a few more segments, but just for the sake of a slide, we're showing just a few. So what you do is you just add them up. And again, you could weight them if you wanted to. Just ask yourself, is it worth it? Are you going to confuse people? But add that up, and then you're going to have a priority list. And here's the thing I always am a fan of. If you do go to a weighted system where you get close scores from each other, regroup them back even numbers. If I have a 3.1 versus a 3.2, they're not really that different. Just come up with an overall priority, give it a rank score, A, B, C, D, and note that it's not perfect. So in this particular case, our values are going to be, let me get a color you can see. We're going to be doing Jones Road 2. We're going to be Smith Street 1 and Smith Street 2. Notice, if you look at this, that we're actually fixing a road, Smith Street 2, that's not had a crash. It's one of the higher priorities because it's got some of those other risk factors involved. Okay. And when you're actually doing the work later on, you and I both know in the real world, you may wind up actually doing some work on Jones Roads 1 and 2 while you're fixing the middle segment. Okay. Looking at spot specific items. But in terms of setting up an overall plan, you're going to go for the highest priorities first. Okay. But how do you get these data? Well, there are different ways to get these data. The first one is to get measured data. That's preferred. There's qualitative data. These are things where you just go yes, no, and you can do them quickly with a road survey, just driving down the road. You can use surrogate data. One of my favorite surrogate data is in this slide right here, and that's the curve sign. That curve speed that's underneath the plaque is a surrogate for how sharp the corner is. It doesn't tell you what the actual radius is. It doesn't tell you what the cross-section super elevation is, but it's a good surrogate for the combined relative safety of that curve. So until you can get out there and measure it, it's a good starting point. And you can always modify these things over time. And then, of course, you should have access with the municipal side, or if you're working on a municipal project with Clear, and we'll talk about Clear in just a minute. Okay. So what measured data do you have? And I'm going to give you about 20 seconds to tell me what measured data you actually have. And then I'll show what everybody else voted for. And drink a sip of my coffee. Okay. What measured data do you have? You have traffic counts. You probably have crashes. You probably have speeds. If you don't, you can get them through the traffic data viewer in the state or go measure them. And there's some simple ways to do it. We could talk about that. You might have as-built drawings. That'd be fantastic if you've got them. You can have accident reports. Okay. But yeah, you've got a lot of information that's available to you. Now, remember, a lot of what you're going to need is probably geometric information, which may not be as available. You may have to go measure it. So you may not have measured data, but do you have some qualitative or surrogate data that's available? Okay. And by the way, you probably all have lane width. If you've got a report to the state or you're the state agency, you know your lane widths. So guess what? You have more than you think. So what qualitative or surrogate data do you see here? What kind of things could you measure just looking up and down this particular roadway that tells you something about the road safety? Well, let's see. Let me just draw on here a few things. Well, we've got a ditch, which obviously the agency thought was enough that they actually put some cones up. Got a sharp ditch, no shoulder at all. Okay. Over here on the right, they've actually paved a shoulder in. So that's actually a place you could mark the shoulder on one side, maybe. Okay. You've got lane width, hopefully already. Does it have a centerline stripe or not? That's a nice qualitative kind of thing. Okay. How about this one? Same concept. Okay. Lane widths, shoulders, rail systems, all are things you could measure, but you could also just do a qualitative yes, no, or do a surrogate like the curve surrogate that I mentioned earlier. So again, think about it for about 20 seconds. What qualitative or surrogate data could you use that you could go get literally just a quick drive-through with one person driving and one person riding? Think about that. What kind of things could you get? I'm going to give you about 20 seconds for that as well. Okay, let's see what y'all come up with. Your signs are actually pretty good surrogate data. Your lane markings can be done. They're qualitative and or surrogate. Yep, the road condition, and road condition may matter, especially if it's an issue of bleeding or polishing stone. Okay, trees, how close to the trees are to the roadway? Are they close, pretty far out, or way out? Again, not as good as measured, but could be a pretty good surrogate, short term or qualitative one. Okay, curb, yes or no? Okay. Do you have deadly fixed objects within what you'd like to see for a clear zone? Does it feel safe? Yeah, that's not as good as other measures, but surprisingly, as a starting point, see what you can come up with. How do people drive that roadway? Okay. So you might actually be able to start putting together a list that you could turn it into risk factors. Remember, the key is at the end, will this help us determine the more risky locations and then tie it back to some kind of actual repair? Now, I do want to mention CLEAR. This is the Crash Location and Engineering Analysis Repository. I don't know who came up with the name, but excellent work in terms of an acronym. Okay. I came up with some really bad acronyms at a conference I was at last week. Okay. But the idea is the data, the crash data that has been put into the state is available through CLEAR, plus other data is available. So you could do some analysis for hotspots and things like that. And by the way, the state's done that in their Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan. But if you haven't seen CLEAR, it's a pretty cool tool. In this case, we looked at Lewis County as an example. You could look at all the crashes. You could look at the fatal and serious crashes, and you can see the number drops by quite a bit. If you go to all crashes that were reported through the police versus those that were put in that are fatal and serious. And if you want, you can even go and zoom right in and actually look at the crash reports. There were two crashes that weren't that far from each other, so we looked at them, and both involved a crossover. And they were in the same curve. Now, they look like different curves. Just make sure whenever you look at these reports, make sure you get a sense of what they did. In this case, they put the north arrow going down on this page and up on this page. And that is actually the same curve. Okay. Is that a hot spot? Two crashes? maybe, maybe not, but it's, again, a risk factor to think about. Maybe there was or wasn't a rumble strip. Maybe the lane is narrow. Maybe the curve radius is involved. You're going to have to go get that, but at least you now have a chance of doing that. And you can develop what are called crash trees using Clear. It's a pretty cool tool. In this case, it's really just more of a big arrow for me. But here's some data. This happens to be St. Lawrence County instead. But there were 85 serious crashes over a 5-year period, or is it 10-year period? Sorry, in this particular case. And you could break it down by things like traffic volume and speed, which are available, okay? And then whether it's on a curved or a straight segment, that's based upon data that's recorded in the crash reports. And you can add them all up, and you'll actually see that high speed, above 35 miles an hour, or at least 35 miles an hour, 95% of all crashes that were serious and fatal. That makes some sense. And curved, 42%. Wow. Not quite half, but a lot of them are near curves. So if we were going to start focusing, we might want to start focusing on our curves and see what we can do there. And of course, you're going to be using proven solutions, and we're going to talk a lot more about proven solutions after our next break, and of course, next week on Thursday. And you can just imagine the kind of different things that are out there, everything from curve-related or roadway departure-related things such as markings and safety edge and rumble strips, to intersection and pedestrian bicycle issues such as crosswalk improvements, roundabouts, and even signals. There's a whole list of them, and we'll talk about those a little bit more after the break. You're then going to have to implement the solutions. And remember, if your solution doesn't have a buy-in from a stakeholder, it's going to be hard to get it implemented because, like it or not, there's not always acceptance of some of the solutions that we come up with. Okay? But a good solution can go a long way, and maybe you have to try a few things. In this case, this is handbell music. I play in a handbell choir. And if you want to flip pages, one of the best tools is Post-it notes. Okay? But you got to get buy-in. People at first are like, how's that going to work? But once you do it, most people don't go back. Now, of course, you have to be able to pay for all of this. There has to be money, whether you're going to do it with your own budget or you're going to go get a grant. How do you do that? And then later on, you know, are you going to be able to maintain it? So it's the capital cost is important, but also the maintenance cost later on. If you put down stripes, for instance, are you going to be able to maintain those stripes year after year after year? And then how often do you update that plan? There are people who argue it has to be done every year. Some say every 5 years. I certainly wouldn't be going every 10 years. That's probably a little bit too long. But think about how you're going to update the plan and when do you update the plan. Good plans should be flexible. But again, I know that implementation is one of the biggest challenges. Now you're probably asking, what do I have to do in an implementation plan? And by the way, it could be called a local road safety plan or just a roadway departure implementation plan. And you're all thinking the same thing right now. Everybody watching on screen, all 50 plus of you, you're all thinking it's too small. I can't read it. That's right. You can't read it. Do not try to read it. This particular plan has been put into the workbook, that Combating Roadway Departures workbook that's linked in the handout. You can go look at it just to get a sense of what's involved. But a good plan is going to have information in it about what countermeasures you're going to use. What is your approach? Is it a systematic, site-specific, or a systemic approach? Maybe it's a comprehensive approach for the overall plan. What sites are you looking at to fix? And of course, what's the estimated cost of doing those repairs? And you really should look at what are the estimated crash reductions, especially the fatal and serious crashes. Now, there's plenty of other things that could be in an implementation plan. And if we had hours, we could talk about that. There's some really good stuff out there about developing plans. It's in some of the links that are available to you. When you're getting done with all of this, what I want you to understand more than anything else, there needs to be a plan focus. Most plans are going to tend to focus on either the risk factors, so a systemic approach in overrepresented crashes. They might look at locations, intersections, corridors, a data-driven kind of approach. And this would be especially valuable if you're trying to also incorporate hotspot kind of analysis. So you do a hotspot plus other locations, especially corridor type analyses. Maybe you do arterials and collectors first. Makes perfect sense when you think about the risk reward kind of thing. Or you could even just pick a countermeasure, especially if you're doing a systematic You pick a countermeasure such as safety edge, such as stripes, such as improved signage, which is what those folks in Humboldt County did, and they cut their crash numbers down 80%, just putting up signs, not even markings, just signs. But the countermeasures. And so you wind up with a comprehensive report that maybe actually has a little bit of all of these in it. Okay. So I'm going to give you an example. This is a completely fake, and yet it's not fake example. But just to keep it small, I was thinking about trying to do the one from Chemung County or Wyoming County that I was part of, or even the St. Regis study that was done. And I couldn't fit it on the screen. They take a little bit more than I can show you. But what I could do is quickly go look at the Cornell Central Campus and just pull some quick data and see what I could come up with. Okay. Now, again, who the stakeholders would be, you might think about who those stakeholders, maybe it's slightly different if you're looking at more of an urban core, though I will admit, I think the best plans typically include multiple jurisdictions. If I was going to do one here in Tompkins County, I would include all of the agencies in the county. Oh, they just released the public version of such a report. It's actually one of the links that you've got available to you for all of Tompkins County, including the city of Ithaca. Okay, but you develop your stakeholders and then develop your risk factors using data. And I just went through and I made some risk factors, the kind of risk factors that we talked about. So knowing where there were some crashes that have occurred in the last few years, I marked them down. Okay, so there was a crash on one of our Garden Avenue segments. There was a crash on a road called Hoy Road. There was a serious crash. There are signals involved because there's obviously intersections can be multiple roads. We've talked about speed and curbs and things like that, and then traffic volumes. So these are all factors. Now notice, I've still got in there a factor which I probably should take out. I left it there on purpose. Speed is something we always think about, but if speed is not a factor that shows up, it's not a common factor for your crash types, take it out. You don't want too many, you don't want too few. How many is too many? We could make that argument, maybe 5 or 10. But if it doesn't change anything, if it's not helping you make a better decision, you would remove it. So in this case, that 45 miles an hour would just be not part of the equation. We'd take it out. We'd do something else that might be a better surrogate. Okay. But again, it's the same concept. You just take all those factors, you add them up, and you come up with a priority listing. Okay. So the first section we're going to work on, because it's got a signal, a curve around a corner, and a high traffic volume, would be what's East Avenue, Feeney Way here at Cornell. That would be your first priority. And then everything else that's a B is next. Now, when you're developing a plan, you're probably going to have more levels than this. But the idea is don't try to get to the point where you're like, well, we have to do this one first and this one second. Give yourself some flexibility. Okay. And there may be a road that just doesn't show up from a safety standpoint. But if later on you're working on a stretch of highway, good time to look at individual issues and see if there's something you can improve, especially if you're already applying a proven countermeasure on the next segment. So it's something to keep in mind. Okay. And then, of course, you would match the countermeasure to the risk factor. In this case, it's a more urban area. So maybe some curve delineation or improvements, maybe some crosswalk improvements, maybe even looking at the signals might be something that'd be worth implementing. You're probably not going to be implementing clear zone or safety edge because there's curbs. You're going to match the countermeasure to the solution. And of course, the challenge with all of this is you got to have the money, you got to implement the solutions, you got to get everybody on board. And that can be part of the challenge. But what I don't want to have happen is we spend all the time and effort to create a lovely report, and then it just sits on a shelf gathering cobwebs. So a plan is not a plan until you're implementing something. Okay. So let's do a quick review of our session 2, and then we'll come back and talk about proven countermeasures. So a couple of quick things for review. Do you remember the 4 implementation strategies? I'll let you type those in for me. What are the 4 implementation strategies? Okay, let's see what y'all came up with. Systemic, very good. There's 4 of them. There probably should be all of your something to think about. Systemic is 1. Site-specific and systematic. Very good. And then what happens if we put them all together? Comprehensive. Very good. Okay. Uh, different ways to think about that. So systematic would lead to policy, standard operating procedures, standards. Okay. A site-specific is your hotspots, sometimes called the more traditional approach. A systemic is a risk-based approach. Okay. In fact, maybe we should call them risk-based and policy-based so we don't confuse ourselves. And then you're going to combine them all together in a comprehensive approach for safe systems. Now, these are data from Ohio. These are fatal crashes occurring between 2018 and 2022, percent by jurisdiction. Okay, and you can see their emphasis areas in their plan were pedestrians, bicycles, heavy vehicles, roadway departures, intersections, and older drivers. Now, statewide might be different than state, county, or city, town, village, but if you're with a county in Ohio, and by the way, they're elected in Ohio, have to licensed engineer and a surveyor, but if you were a county, where do you think you would start in terms of your focus crash types? If the emphasis is, you actually can click on the picture. You get to click on the picture. Where would you put your money? And yeah, you can either click on the percentage or you can click on the actual emphasis area. Either one's fine. Yeah. 57% of the county crashes are roadway departure crashes. So yeah, if you were going to develop a comprehensive safety plan, you would probably start with roadway departures, which is what we've done here in New York State. And then after that, you might go to intersections for the county, while the state might actually want to go to heavy vehicles. Okay. And by the way, if you were with a city, town, or village, and they didn't break them out, so we don't really know if it's really just a city village issue, they would focus on intersections to start with. And that's why having good data can really help you develop a plan. Now, with that, stole 1 minute from you. Okay. But any questions you've got? And again, I'll open this back up. You can add your questions in. We'll try to make sure they get answered. And then we're going to come back, in this case, at the top of the hour. So we will be back at 11 a.m. See y'all in 15 minutes. Well, 14. I'll give you the minute back at the end. Okay, we're going to start back up here, and I owe you 1 minute. Before we get into the proving countermeasures, I just do want to quickly run over to the CMF clearinghouse. Hopefully answer a couple of those questions or at least get us started. There was nothing in the CMF clearinghouse about either of the questions about moving the rail back or trees acting as a bit of a quote unquote visual friction. Now, I've seen articles on that. That comes into the world of traffic calming. There's a lot of myths out there about good traffic calming. We're actually redoing our class on that. And in fact, we're trying to figure out when we're going to hold a pilot and how we're going to get that out to everybody. But just so you know that, yeah, there actually is some value in setting up a road that looks like it's a tree-lined boulevard. The key there from the studies I've seen deals with the fact that if the tree is right at the curb line, you don't get as much benefit as you think. So you want to think about where you're putting them within the curb line, and narrowing the roadway up has both a negative and a positive, and you're trying to balance two things at the same time. As for putting the rail further back, there actually is a benefit to putting the rail further back. But the challenge, of course, there is making sure, as someone mentioned in their question, making sure you have the deflection distance that's involved, and making sure that the rail is in such a place that would actually get struck at the right height. And we won't be talking about that much today, I apologize, but we definitely will be talking about that next Thursday. So I'll leave those questions active in the question and answer thing, and maybe we can do a little more detail on them next week. So now let's spend some time talking about the proven countermeasures. And again, we'll get you out of here at the top of the next hour. Our primary goals for this one is really just to help you develop a list of the proven countermeasures applicable for your agency. Not every single countermeasure is applicable in every single situation. You know, a median barrier is not going to help a county that doesn't have any divided roadways, as an example. And then I really want you to start to identify the proven countermeasures for all three of the FHWA focus areas, because while we're focused on combating roadway departures, you're going to come across things where there's an overlap. And I'd like you to know there are other proven countermeasures out there. And so next week, when we're talking about the proven countermeasures for combating roadway departures, you can understand we're just talking about a subset. So let's start talking about developing a list of proven countermeasures. That includes everything from chevrons and rumble strips to high friction surface treatment, clear zones and barriers, whether you call them guide rail or guardrail. By the way, if you ever search on the CMF clearinghouse, make sure you look for both guide rail and guardrail because they come up difference in the searches. Try different words. But let's develop a list of proven countermeasures. And again, we can go crazy looking at the different choices. I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I want you to know there's actually a lot out there that you can use. And so the two places I would have you start with, one is the FHWA's Proven Countermeasures, a booklet, which is highlighted in the handout that we have for today, and also in the Combating Roadway Departures workbook. And also, there are subsets of that. For instance, this is one specifically put out by the FHWA for roadway departure countermeasures. Okay, again, it's a highlighted thing. And these tables exist for different purposes. They show you the kind of crashes they work with, whether the expected cost, things of that ilk. And so these are tools that you want to think about using. And we're going to talk a lot more about the specific ones for roadway departures as part of the session next week. As for the list of proven countermeasures, well, FHWA, if you're getting certain funds like Safe Streets for All funds, you need to be choosing from that list. So to be eligible to get money, they need to be from that list. And they actually have a link of the 28 proven countermeasures. And I just want to sort of review those with you over this hour and highlight where some of them might be used, especially in the combating roadway departure world. Now, let's just see if anybody remembers. I'm making you go back, I know, an hour. What are the three FHWA crash focus areas? Do you remember what those three crash focus areas are? Actually, it's an hour and a half, now that I think about it. Intersections, that's good. That's one. Curves, well, curves, sort of. What's the title of this class? Roadway departures, yep, and then bicycles and pedestrians. And what term is going to be used? There are some people who use the term vulnerable road users. I know right now that phrase is not being used at the federal level. It's just still bicycles, pedestrians. But again, I think of it as people not inside of a piece of steel, which, by the way, includes flaggers and road workers, people who are very much exposed when they're out working. So yeah, intersections, roadway departures, and bicycles and pedestrians. Okay, very good. So in terms of countermeasures, when you're trying to make a list of what you're going to apply in your area, and they may be a systemic or systematic approaches or even a hotspot approach, think about what is the effect on crash frequency and crash severity within your community. Again, there's no point in putting into your list of tools in the toolkit something that's not going to change the crash frequency, okay? Trying to get a 30-foot clear zone on a low volume local road system isn't going to happen. So let's decide what's valuable. What are we going to shoot for? We're going to shoot for a slightly narrower clear zone that meets our needs, and it still give us some value, some positive impact. What is it going to do to the crash severity? And does it move us towards that safe systems approach? You really want to be thinking about that, looking at the comprehensive, looking at the site-specific issues and the systemic issues as well. Okay? which means you need to be thinking about all road users. That includes your drivers, your buses, your trucks, your pedestrians, your bicyclists, your road workers, okay? I'd put them in the top 5 of my list, top 2 or 3 even, because they're out there working, really important people. Then anything we're doing should include them as well. If you're going to do it, how are you going to pay for it? If you want to go get a grant, is it eligible for funding? Or you have to do it with local dollars? And then maybe the single most important question when you're trying to decide on countermeasures is, can you maintain it? When we talk about rail systems later on, we'll mention cable rail. I will be completely honest, a lot of small agencies, I don't recommend cable rail to them. Even though it has the best deflection distance and it's got some real value, if you can't maintain the turnbuckles, if you can't keep the cables nice at the proper tension, should you be putting that kind of system up, or should you be looking at a more system like a rail system that's going to be less in terms of maintenance? And then, of course, what types of projects are you going to do these countermeasures as part of? Are they self-standing safety projects, or do you do it as part of a paving project like a safety edge, or putting in new signage as you're doing a reconstruction or rehabilitation along a roadway? Okay, so keep that in mind. And whenever you're doing these things, it does not take that long to just go to the CMF clearinghouse and do a quick search. But remember, if you're not going to read the report, choose the ones with the 4-star or 5-star value. And then just check that error out a little bit. It doesn't take long and it's definitely worth doing. Some of the reports from FHWA have already done some of that work for you, and the ones that are selected are the ones that are the high value, low error kind of repairs. Okay. Now, to illustrate this for you, how you might choose something, decide what you're going to add to the system, I need to do a quick review of rumble strips. Okay, now we'll get into this a lot more next week and even touch on a little bit this hour. But there's 2 different rumbles I'm going to talk about on the edge of the roadway. One is called a shoulder rumble. That's the most common one. That's the one you're probably very familiar with. You've got a paved shoulder, you've got an edge line, and just outside the edge line, there is a rumble strip that you hit. It's sometimes called a shard because the A in the shard stands for audio. So you can hear it and feel it when you drive over it. Okay. And so it's a delineator, really, but it's an audio delineator. Okay. If you don't have a lot of space, you can do something called an edge line rumble. Okay, and that can be a rumble strip or a stripe, and there is a slight nuance and a difference. In this case, this is a rumble stripe where the line and the rumble are right on top of each other. So you put down the rumble, then you actually put the line on top of that, and there's some advantages to that. We'll talk about that next week. But I want you to just understand the difference between the two, and just to keep the space difference small, I'm calling one a shoulder rumble. I didn't use the word shard, but I could have. And an edge line rumble, or ELR. I don't have a good ELR sound to it, but just keep it in mind. So here's an example decision process you might use for run off the road crashes. And then if you can create a chart like this, then you can say, yep, that's probably worth adding to my system. If you can't, then you either decide to just do it systematically or you don't include it in your system. So in this case, we might ask questions like, is a rumble strip allowed? Can somebody in the Q&A tell me why that might be a good question to start with for a rumble strip? Where would you not want to have a rumble strip? Somebody in the Q&A want to tell me where you might not want a rumble strip. There's about 3 or 4 reasons why you might not want a rumble strip. Maybe be careful in a bike route. Now, there are ways you can have bikes and rumble strips work together, okay? But maybe on old deteriorating pavement, you don't want it. Yeah, that's a good example. How about in a residential area? Some people don't put them in residential areas, or don't put them in certain communities. Maybe you want to go to a mumble strip in that case, and we'll talk more about that next week. But there might be a situation where there are places in your community where you don't want a rumble strip. So in that case, you would probably only look at putting in stripes, and then maybe use traffic volume to decide what stripes you're going to put in. In that case, maybe you go with a certain traffic volume and do a 4-inch standard edge line. And then if it's a higher traffic, if you go to a 6-inch edge line, this is your decision tree for what you're going to do, in this case, systematically. Okay. And then maybe on arterials and collectors, you really want to have the rumble strip with the shoulder. Okay. And maybe it depends on the lane width and what you've already got. So arterials and collectors with a paved shoulder, you're going to put in a 6-inch edge line with a shoulder rumble strip. If the existing lane width isn't wide enough, okay, then maybe you got to pave a 4-foot shoulder and then put down your 6-inch edge line, your rumble strip. For arterials and collectors, maybe it's worth it. And then finally, if it's got enough lane width, if it's really wide, maybe you can just put in the 6-inch with a shoulder rumble and then just narrow the lane up slightly. Again, these are decisions you'd have to make. And then on your local system, if you've got the paved shoulder, you can go ahead and go with the 6-inch, or maybe just drop it back to a 4-inch edge line. That's again a decision you'd have to make. And then maybe you're going to go with a 4-inch edge rumble strip if you don't have a paved shoulder on the local system. Okay. And of course, you could add ADT back into this and make it even more complicated. But the idea is develop little decision trees for yourself. That can be very helpful in deciding whether you're going to add this to your toolkit. And then, of course, it comes back to your implementation strategies. So is this going to be a systematic item like traffic lines, rumble strips, safety edge, things like that? And is this going to become a policy or standard operating procedure? Or did our data find hotspots that we need to fix? And we're going to do hot site-specific implementation? Or is this a systemic or risk-based approach? The overall concept is develop a local road or a comprehensive safety plan and leading towards this concept of the safe system. And then adding in what we need to do in the way of education and enforcement, safe vehicles, safe roads, and post-crash care. So FHWA has 28 proven safety countermeasures, okay? And they're available in the booklet. You can read through them. It's a pretty good thing to read. I would advise doing so. And I want to go through some of those with you. They break them into 5 or 6 different areas. The first one is speed management, okay? We're not going to talk a lot about the speed management ones, but speed management can include things like variable speed limits, speed cameras, which are becoming popular or unpopular, depending on which side of the camera you're on, or just setting the speed limits properly. And there are tools out there, such as US limits, to set the speed, matching mostly what people do and the conditions around it, and coming up with a speed limit that is semi-self-enforcing. I didn't say completely self-enforcing, but semi-self-enforcing, okay? Okay, there's bicycle pedestrian. Again, one of the 3 primary focus areas, which then include bike lanes, lighting at night, pedestrian signals, better crosswalks, hawk symbols, or flashing beacons, road diets, and other terms, though road diet is, again, one of those ones that's not currently being used at the federal level. So again, if you come across one of those, just think to yourself, how are you going to implement or not implement something like that? And then, of course, even pedestrian paths and sidewalks could be a good thing, separating the vehicles from the traffic. There are roadway departures. Again, we're going to focus a lot on these next week, but that can include delineation, rumble strips, median barriers, rail systems, safety edge, and even the shoulder width, okay? Intersections, again, the third of the 3 focus areas, which would include better signals, offset intersections, different curves, even different kind of ways you get into the curve, including our friend the roundabout. And of course, just better signage can make a big difference, and better signals can make a difference as well, and setting the timings properly. There are some that cross-cut, that go across all of these different issues, okay? So we'll get back to more lighting, for instance, not lighting just for pedestrians, but general lighting in of itself can make a big difference. There are going to be road safety audits and assessments that you might look at. There's going to be issues with friction, which really helps in all situations. And of course, we've already talked about local road safety plans. So I want you to realize there's a list of proven countermeasures. There's statistics behind all these. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. So I want you to keep that in mind. Now, the proven safety countermeasure booklet, which again is highlighted in your handout, you can go look at it. Each page is going to have a description of the proven safety countermeasure. It's going to give you some typical applications, and then it's going to give you the safety benefits. That might include the safe crash modification factor. It doesn't do so in every single case, but most of them do actually also give you a typical benefit to cost ratio. And so that is a way for you to explain to the public why we're putting in a roundabout, why we want to put up speed cameras, why we want to have widened shoulders, what it's doing in terms of value for the community. And so there's some really good information in there that you can share as part of the education process. Now, in the back of the Roadway Departure Safety Action Plan, New York State did include their countermeasure selection matrix, slightly different than the proven countermeasures from FHWA, but really, really close. And so the big thing there that I would take home is to look at that or other materials. There's information there about cost, because of course you got to pay for it. And they added in the chart the DOT did, whether they're valuable for nighttime crashes as well, because we know nighttime is an issue for those of us whose eyes are getting a little harder to see at night. So which proven countermeasure? Well, that's the cool thing is we got a whole selection of eggs, more than 24, and we get to choose from them. But again, you're probably not going to implement all 28, so you need to decide which are most applicable for your agency. If you're with an MPO or a consulting firm, you probably need to think about all of them, but some are not going to be applied in certain situations. So what I want to do is go through them, but just to start us off, I've given you a list of 8 proven solutions that we know have been used in New York State. Okay, that includes pavement markings, delineation for curves, rumble strips, safety edge, improvement in the clear zone, crosswalk improvements, roundabouts, and improved signals. Which of the of those have you actually implemented? Which have you used or your agency has used? Or if you're a consultant, you've been involved in a process where it was designed and used. So which of these have you used? Let's see what y'all come up with. And there are 50 of you on the call, so I'm hoping we get a large number, and you should be able to select more than one. So I should be able to get a lot more than 50 votes. You can select more than one. We'll give you another 20 seconds to see if anybody gets above at least half of you. It's probably like a lot of us, you're not voting. And while you do that, I'm going to move to my other cup of coffee. Okay, so pretty much of the people who voted, pretty much all of you said pavement markings. Yeah, that's not surprising. Curve delineation, pretty good percentage. Crosswalk improvements for intersection work, better signals, and even roundabouts. Yeah. I'm a little surprised that safety edge is a little higher, but hopefully we can talk about that in clear zones between today and next Thursday. And again, I want you to know something is in your toolkit and to use it properly. Now, the first one we've already talked about is local road safety plans that I want to highlight this in our hour together to end our day together. In this particular case, this is essentially the goal, is to develop a plan and implement that plan. And whether you call it a local road safety plan, a comprehensive safety plan, a roadway departure safety action plan, the idea is to have a plan in place specific to your system that you start to implement, okay? And it may take a while, but that's a pretty important thing to have, okay? Now, this is one road safety audits. I'm going to be asking you to raise your hand a lot this next hour, so just be ready for it. So how many of you have done or been involved with a road safety audit? Raise your hand if you've been involved in a road safety audit. Okay, let's see how many of you. Probably not a lot. And yet, to me, this is one of my favorite tools. Now, you can do it a formal approach, which is called a road safety audit, which comes up with a formal report after you're done. You can also do what we like to call a road safety assessment, where you informally bring the same people together to try to come up with a consensus,
solution that everybody can talk about. And actually, here we're doing one in the town of Clarence. That's Jamie there with the town of Dussing from the town of Clarence. He's the highway superintendent. But you can see we've got 8 to 12 people, 15 at the upper end, representing the different viewpoints looking at a safety problem. Okay? In this case, in an HOA, homeowners association area on some town roads. So we've got people from the sheriff's office, the state troopers, we've got a couple of local businesses, a board member, the highway departments. We've got people who are with the HOA themselves. We've even got somebody from the local school that does buses up and down the road. In fact, we got passed by a bus while we were out there. We met, we looked at the problem. We then met at the town hall to go over some statistics and details. And my job there was to act as a facilitator. It's actually good to have somebody who can act as a facilitator to go through the process, whose stake in the game is safety improvement and not local stake in the game. That can actually be very, very helpful. This is something some MPOs actually can help you with if you're part of an MPO. Really great way to look at a problem. In fact, you can use it for everything. You don't have to just use it for safety. You could use it for figuring out the next time you're going to be replacing the town barn, or what kind of equipment you want to get. Get different viewpoints and get different ideas, and you may find that's actually a pretty cool solution. So I'm a big fan of road safety audits or assessments, and it's a proven countermeasure. Doesn't cost a lot of money, but can be a very good way to get consensus, and as part of that education process, which is part of that overall safe systems approach, because you get everybody on board. Okay. High friction surface treatment. How many of you have done a high friction surface treatment? Raise your hand. Probably not a lot of you. There's a reason for that. 2, yeah, I'm not surprised. Just a couple of you. Here's the idea. If you've got an aggregate problem, or you've got roads that you don't have enough demand, you can put in what's called a high friction surface treatment. And we'll talk about these a lot more detail, but watch carefully. The vehicle on the left, on the high friction bauxite, actually in this case, it's a red granite, but a higher friction rock than normal. Okay. You'll notice the vehicle stopped a lot faster. Okay. So it's 25 to 30% faster. You get more friction demand going around the corner. We'll talk a lot more about this next week, but I will tell you, there's a reason we don't actually use this a lot in New York State, though it has been used very successfully out on Long Island where they have aggregate issues in high traffic. And that is, we have a really darn good friction program with our aggregates here in New York State. As long as you're ordering a high friction aggregate when you're paving or chip sealing, you're probably going to be in pretty good shape. And so the high friction surface treatment is really only needed when you're going to go that little extra. You just need that little extra, maybe on a bridge or where you've got aggregate problems. And you can solve this problem by just asking for high friction, but it has some value to it. Okay. So that's why we don't see a lot of high friction in New York State, but it can be very valuable. In fact, Pennsylvania uses it quite often because the rock quality changes, and you do need good rock to make this work. And by the way, good high friction surface treatment is also a pavement preservation tool. So it's both a surface treatment and a safety improvement at the same time. Okay. Delineation for horizontal curves is something that everybody should have in your bag of tools. So how many of you have been involved in delineation on curves? That means chevrons, warning signs, all that fun stuff, even stripes. Please raise your hand. Everybody probably should be at some point in their career. As we'll talk next week, this particular technique has some of the best crash reduction factors and really even better cost, benefit ratios, tremendously high benefit cost ratios. The biggest challenge is if you put something down, can you maintain it? Okay. So can you maintain the center line and the edge line if you're a small agency? And even for a large agency, how does it survive the winter? But delineation makes a huge difference. In fact, there are some requirements in the manual on uniform traffic control devices that you need to keep in mind. Okay, certain types of road that have to have this. We'll get into the specifics of that next week, but I just want you to make sure you're aware of that because delineation makes a huge difference in keeping people in their lane, getting them around the corner, And if they're in their lane going around the corner, guess what? We don't have a crash. Good thing. Okay. So just as an example, one of the tools you need to have is you need to have a tool that tells you what the speed is going around the corner. And it's about 4 or 5 ways to do it. So how many of you know how to use a ball bank indicator? And you can answer one of 3 things: yes, no, or what the heck's a ball bank? And I'm okay with that last question. In fact, that's exactly why I have it in here. New York State has actually looked at all of their curves. So those of you who are state, they've already looked at all the curves using a device that's an accelerometer-based method called Riker. It's very, very similar in terms of what it will give you. There are some nuances, but overall, the idea is what we're not trying to do is tell people the safe speed going around the curve. What we're trying to do is tell people a relative speed versus the main roadway. Okay, so we're giving them a consistent message as they're going around the curve. And the idea behind a ball bank indicator is one of the ways to help going around the corner is there's a little black ball here. We'll show a video of this next week. And as you go around the corner, that little ball swings up because it's in some liquid. Okay, and as long as it doesn't swing up too far, that's a not safe speed, but it's a consistent measure of the relative sharpness of that particular corner. Okay, it's designed around wet pavement and it's designed around driver comfort, but it gives a consistent message. So if you see a curve sign that says 30 miles an hour with a plaque under the sign, you know, hopefully, if we've done our job right, that particular curve drives about the same as any other 30-mile-an-hour curve. So if you're driving around there with a old, minivan, then you probably need to be going around 30 miles an hour. If you're driving around it in a DB Cooper, see if anybody caught the joke, but if you drive around it in a Mini Cooper, then you could probably go a little faster. On the other hand, if you're in a big truck, maybe you got to go even slower than that. You learn to drive the roadway consistently by having consistent signage. And that's something we all need to do. Every agency needs to have good, consistent signage. And the 2 most common techniques are these accelerometer-based hands or a ball bank indicator, which is really a form of that, okay? And again, if you have any questions on any of these as we go through, please throw them in the Q&A and I'll try to answer them as we go through here. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the proven countermeasures that exist. But delineation is one of the best bang for the bucks that we can possibly do before we spend the money on the next one, which is the roadside design improvements themselves. Okay, I'm not arguing that roadside design improvements aren't a very important tool. In fact, we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about this for roadway departures next week, but they cost more. And so we typically do those on the more critical, sharper corners with a little bit higher volume. This is a road in Livingston County. It actually goes up to the county complex that is a really sharp corner, not justifiable to fix. It's a driveway, really. It's not the fastest way to even get into the complex. So why would you put a lot of money and effort into fixing that? Versus if it were 3,000 cars a day, you might want to improve the improvements. Where done properly, using a systemic approach, roadside design improvements can make a big difference. So I know you've been waiting for me. Raise your hand if you've actually changed the alignment, width, or put on special paving or other improvements at a curve. Raise your hand if you've done that in your career. I can raise mine. Again, something to make sure it's in your toolkit. And where it's needed, it can be really valuable for things like drop-offs, curves that need to be widened out, changing the radius slightly. You might have to worry about even right-of-way at that particular point. Okay? Now, clear zone, or sometimes called removing fixed objects, depending on whether you're reading the FHWA's proven countermeasures or DOT's the roadway departure safety action plan. The idea is give people a space where if they do go off the roadway, they don't hit something that could lead to a serious accident or a fatality. Now, how wide should that clear zone be? We can talk about a little bit, but how many of you have actually widened the clear zone out? few of you have. If you work for a local agency, okay, magically your hands are all going to get lowered now. If you work for a local agency or you're with a consultant, has your local agency set a policy on what the clear zone should be? Raise your hand if anybody has had that happen, or if you're on a town board or you know the town board has done so. Not surprised, but it is something we should think about. We should have a clean, consistent clear zone. How wide should that clear zone be? We can talk about that a bit, but here's the key. We want consistency, and we want to make sure that if we have a policy, we follow. Remember, policies that are good, great. Bad policy or one that's not followed can get you in trouble. So I'm going to show you a picture. Raise your hand if you want to swear and you lose a tire. Raise your hand when I show you the next picture if going off into the grass to the right is a good idea. How many of you would think, okay, going off into the grass on the right? Raise your hand. Everybody's suspicious. I suspect that or they're drinking their coffee. Only a few of you. Well, either you figured it out or you've seen this before. There's some stumps still sitting there. Clear zones need to be consistent. Consistency really is important, and they don't need to be as wide as you might think to give that consistency. But the big thing is once you set a policy, you really want to hold to it. And once you remove a tree, cut it down flush. Okay? Does anybody know the maximum height you should leave the stump after you're done? Want to throw that in the Q&A for me? What's the maximum height? What do you think? 6 inches? Good thought. I'd sling one of my virtual coasters at you. Ah, there we go, 4 inches. Think about a small car like a Honda Civic or a Ford Fiesta or something like that, or that Cooper I mentioned earlier. Even 4 inches or above 4 inches can snag the end of that vehicle and lead to problems. So cut them flush, grind them down. Don't necessarily remove the stump, but please don't leave them up like this. Because remember, trees are by far the most dangerous fatal object crash. Okay? And it's that consistency that's really going to make a difference that we have for improving safety. We don't want to create a hotspot by not having consistency. And that means that if we have to put something inside the clear zone, and we do, we have signs, we have mailboxes. Well, we want to make sure that whatever we put in the clear zone is crash worthy, breakaway, or you can drive over it. In this case, that was just a single post, but it wasn't breakaway and created a lot of damage. So breakaway hardware is absolutely key. Just a simple breakaway. It doesn't take much. In fact, some of them are literally under $1 even these days and can actually make it a little bit easier to install. So something to keep in mind. Pavement markings, both on the straightaway and on curves, can be very, very valuable. Okay. There's a huge value to having lines. You know, this road isn't bad. It's nice and straight and wide open. But look what happens when we add a stripe. Okay. Or an edge line. It's much easier to see, right? And when is it really valuable? Well, I'll tell you right now, I mentioned the getting older thing. For me, it's at twilight. I've actually lately found that I sometimes will actually stop at this time of day. Once it gets to this, until the lights actually come back a little bit, can really be hard for me to drive. I have to be honest with myself. So once it's night, I'm actually better off assuming I've got good stripes. Stripes make a big difference. And so having a striping program can matter. So does anybody here know, raise your hand if your agency has a striping program, that you've got a plan, a policy in place. Raise your hand. Again, you probably want to have one because once you put them down, you got to be able to maintain them. And that's pretty important. Didn't want to cough on you. So, now, I did mention I was going to talk a little bit about wider edge lines. We'll talk more about this next week when we get into the details of the wider edge lines. But the crash modification factor, okay, is pretty high. It's 0.78, i.e. about 22% crash reduction for serious crashes just by going from a 4-inch to a 6-inch edge line. So really not a lot, because you're really only paying for the extra paint. You're already, you know, the person coming down the road just still going down the road with the striper. But you get a reduction of 20%. So something to think about on your higher volume roadways. So yeah, you have to think about the cost, but there's something to deal with. Now here's a question for you. It's again, I haven't mentioned it yet, but let me see what you think. They just put out the new MUTCD about a year and a half ago now. Okay, it is the standard. Are 6-inch pavement markings required? And by the way, any of these answers is okay, but I want you to be just thinking about that for a sec. Some of you got no, and the answer is, by the way, no. They thought about making it 6-inch, but they decided at the end to leave it at not required. But it's perfectly acceptable. It's a May situation, and it's not a bad idea for high volume. Decide if you want to do this, where you might want to do it, okay? And this is why it's so important to know what the standards are so you don't get yourself into trouble. So this is when you can take yourself off the not sure. The answer, it is not required. It's not a shall, okay? It's not even a should. It's a may, but it can be very, very cost effective, especially on higher volume roadways or places where you've got certain issues along the edge. And we'll talk more about this next week. Ah, time for the controversial one. Let's have a little fun with controversy. How many of you have like rumble strips? This time we'll do it differently. We'll just, how many of you like rumble strips? Raise your hand if you like rumble strips. Okay. So about 16 or so of you like rumble strips. I'm going to lower everybody's hand. How many of you don't like, yeah, there we go. How many of you don't like rumble strips? Be honest. I'm just looking at the total number. I'm not looking at names. I don't care about names. Few of you don't like rumble strips. That's cool. Okay. This to me is a good example, and we of course are going to have one more of these as we talk about our general repairs. This is a good example of things that as we do them, we have to be careful how we apply them, and we're going to have to do education to help people understand how they work. Now, they usually come in two major flavors, and the two terms they use are shards and cards, okay? So the ARD stands for Audible Roadway Delineator, okay? If you're wondering what ARD stands for. So shoulder audible roadway delineator, and CAR is centerline audible roadway delineator. But the key I want you to understand here is they have their place as long as we think about all of the users. So you can put them on the shoulder, but are there bicyclists? If there are, you need to have brakes for the bicyclists to get in and out. Okay. Or you need to use the ones that aren't quite as deep that bicyclists can't actually go over, or maybe in a residential area, the mumble strip that I mentioned earlier. We'll talk a lot more about these later on, but they have their place when they're ready to be placed. Okay. Now, how many of you, whether you like them or not, have driven over a centerline rumble strip or an edgeline rumble strip and realized that you were not paying attention? Raise your hand if that's happened to you. Yeah, they can be extremely valuable. Okay. They have a very high benefit cost ratio, and they have a really darn high crash modification factor. So they can be very, very valuable, which is why people like having policies of putting them in. And we'll talk a lot more about some of the issues with them later on. But I do want to get two things in your head just as a reminder. Number one, the dimensions, they use the term length. You and I would call that width. Okay. So this rumble strip going down this road is a 12 to 16-inch length. And that has to do with how you put them in. You grind them in place. So it's the length of the grinding if you're grinding them from the side. You might call that width. I just want you to be aware of that. Keep that in the head. The edge line ones that are, not as wide like we talked earlier, those are only 8 to 12. And heck, people have put down 6 to 4-inch ones. They have their place. It's the old saying, do what you can with what you've got where you are, and a substantive improvement may be better than trying to go full hog if you just economically can't do so. Okay. Now you can actually put the stripe right on top, the edge stripe right on the edge of it. Um, in this case, you can see the difference in the rain. Now I'll be honest with you, I actually prefer it to one side, to the driver's side of the rumble itself. So you would actually put the edge line over to the left side there if you were driving along the roadway. But it can make a big difference and holds up pretty well in the winter as long as the pavement is ready to take that rumble. Okay. And in terms of the value of the crash modification, as you can see, those are pretty darn good crash modifications for just putting in a rumble strip with pretty darn low errors. All crashes down by over 10%, and opposite direction crashes over 20%, and the ones with injuries or worse, 25%. That's a pretty good bang for the buck. Okay. Now there's a little more error with the injury one, and you got to be putting them in the right places. But there's a lot of value in putting down rumble strips. And if you're wondering and worried about the maintenance of the pavement, some agencies have started actually chip sealing or sand sealing over the top of the rumble. It's a little less effective, but it can help in terms of protecting the pavement. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind as you're going along. Now, this one ought not to be controversial. But how many of you have heard of or used Safety Edge? Raise your hand if you've heard or used Safety Edge. Now, I wouldn't call this a mission in my part, but I'd love to see Safety Edge, not just as a standard, but one that's used by as many agencies as absolutely possible. Now, we saw this video earlier of the test run at the Texas Transportation Institute, where they were doing testing in the 80s to show what happens if someone drives off the road and then tries to bring their vehicle back up without slowing down. And it's really hard to control. Okay. And so we know that rough ruts that are formed along the edge of the pavement can be one of the most dangerous things along the edge of the roadway. But even just paving it until you get that shoulder backed up can be a very dangerous situation. So what they came up with was this thing called the safety edge. And we'll talk a lot more about this next week. But the idea is at the end of it, you're going to have a 30 to 35-degree angle in the asphalt paving. It's built into the paver, so it's got most of the compaction done just by the paver's vibration. Okay. And so it actually protects the edge of the pavement and lasts longer. So it's actually more durable. And to illustrate this, watch the video. And again, I'll show more of this later on. But you can see there's almost no damage to this pavement that's brand new for dump trucks driving over it. If you did that on most, the normal edge, it wouldn't survive at all. So a safety edge can be really valuable and gives you more time to get that shoulder backed up, though you still want to back up that shoulder if at all possible. So keep that in mind. It's definitely something you want to add to your list of tools. Okay. So just based on what I've told you now, we'll refocus on this more, but just what do you think the two benefits are for the safety edge, or New York State calls it the safety wedge? You get to select two, so let's see how y'all do here. Yeah, very good. Yeah, it's improving the durability and improving safety. You still got to back up the things, and it doesn't save any asphalt. It really doesn't add that much. In fact, it adds so little that if the price is going high, you need to talk with your contractor. I met with New York Materials a couple of weeks ago, and yeah, they like Safety Edge as well. And if you're finding contractors who are charging you extra above, literally 1% or less, you might want to talk to New York Materials. That shouldn't be happening because it's actually easy for them to do and actually makes a more durable pavement for them. Let's go controversy time. This is even more controversial than rumble strips. Okay. Now, raise your hand if you love roundabouts. Like roundabouts. Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Okay. Oh, good number of you. Okay. Magically now, Jody or Amanda, lower the hands. Now, raise your hand if you hate roundabouts. Okay, so some of you hate roundabouts. By the way, the public, on the whole, doesn't like roundabouts. Okay? So it's just something we have to deal with. It's a reality of it. So we have to do some education. And before I go on to the roundabout thing, I do see a comment about the safety edge not implemented in Connecticut. Somebody didn't know why. If you see agencies starting to and then stopping to use it, try to talk to them. There are some nuances for how you first put it in. That could be part of the equation. And if you do find out why someone didn't put it in, let us know. We'd be glad to follow up and improve that. I do know of a couple of counties who've implemented it. And again, if you've got curbs, you're obviously not going to be doing it. But it doesn't take up much extra space. In fact, very little. We're talking literally less than a few inches extra space to put them in. Okay. And we'll talk more about them next week. So roundabouts, why do we like roundabouts? Well, the big thing with a roundabout, and again, this isn't a roadway departure issue, but it's a proven countermeasure I want to hear about, has to do with conflict points. If you think about an intersection, and this is without the pedestrian issue to start, and then we'll talk about pedestrians in a second, but if you think about it, there are 32 vehicle conflicts with going on. And some of those are crossing vehicle conflicts, which are some of the most dangerous, where you T-bone somebody. Okay, some of the most dangerous, of course, right in the middle of the intersection, some of the worst possible ones. And of course, you've got all the conflicts of crossing that occur. Okay, so these are all things you got to worry about. And then pedestrians, there are 24 pedestrian conflict points. Vehicles coming from the left, from the right, from straight. And yes, traffic lights can help, but there's just a lot more conflict points. So the reason we like roundabouts is we've reduced the number of conflict points with vehicles down to only 8, and the pedestrian conflict points down to 8 as well. And if you do it right, the pedestrians can only have to cross one lane at a time, and they should be set up so that you design the roundabout to think about the pedestrians so they can cross in a safe way. It is hard to go backwards if you've already put a roundabout in that wasn't designed for pedestrians and put the pedestrians in it. You actually do need to include them when you're putting them in the first place. And we'll talk about this more if you're interested. But again, we're talking about roadway departures next week. Now, we'll see if the video plays today. It was fighting me this morning. Yeah, here we go. It's playing today. Yay. Now, this is an intersection that is right on the edge of traffic volume to let people get into the roundabout. Okay, there are rules for where roundabouts work and don't work. They're a great tool, but people have to get used to them. There are people I know who would never be able to get in here because they just can't get into that space. So it's something you do need to think about. A well-implemented roundabout can be very, very effective. Okay, but again, there's a lot of people who, oh, I hate roundabouts. And I know people here in Ithaca who don't like the couple of roundabouts we have. It's going to be an education issue. It's going to take some time. And there are always going to be those people who just, for whatever reason, think, well, that's the way we've always done it, but really haven't done it that long with standard intersections. So it's something to keep in mind. It's going to definitely take some education to do that thing. And they can be very effective for hotspot intersections or places where we've got capacity problems. Okay. Now, mini roundabouts are pretty cool. We have a few of these here in Ithaca. Seattle is the place that started them first in the United States. These little mini roundabouts where they literally just put a small island and then the vehicles go around them. Okay. Now, the thing about it, they work, but you got to think about the traffic that's using the intersection. So you really want to check a turning template, either electronically or the old plastic ones, and see if vehicles can get through here. Okay. The 3 vehicles you got to worry about the most: fire trucks, snow plows, and any commercial deliveries. And you do need to be able to get those vehicles around. And there's a lot of movement. You might need to think about something else. Yes, that's a mountable curve, but you really don't want the vehicles to have to do that on a regular basis. So they can be very effective in a small urban area. Now, again, we haven't talked about the numbers, and because of our time issue, we can't talk about them too much. But what do you think is the roundabout reduction of fatal? Yeah, we'll see if everybody selects the last one too. Here's the thing. It's a bit of a trick question. It depends on the roundabout. Statistically, overall, it's above 50%, 60 to 80. But the reality is, they're going to be depending on the situation you deal with. Okay. So the big thing I've noticed with most roundabouts is you've got to design the roundabout for the site, and you've got to think about all the users using it. Okay. So that's something to keep in mind. Okay. Now, there are plenty of other things you can do. There's low-cost countermeasures that stop controlled intersections. Okay. Just putting up new signage, extra signage. There's all kinds of tricks you can do there. The big key with most intersection signage is do it right. I mean, that sign's just a little low. I mean, should be taller than me. I should not be able to put my hand over the top of it. Okay. So we know we can do better than that. That's something to keep in mind. And of course, if you just put up extra stop signs, that may or may not solve the problem. It may make things worse. Here's a study they did in Michigan where they put in extra stop signs due to political pressure, and watch what happened to the speeds. Before they put up the stop sign at Price Road, yes, people did go faster through the intersection. But notice what happened. People started going a little faster in the block between Edwards and Millard, and they see this in other places. But here's what's even worse. One of the most dangerous places in an intersection is the time when you're going from, let me get a good color here. Let's see, I'm going to go with the green this time, is the place where you're accelerating and decelerating. That's actually one of the most dangerous portions. Well, here, the deceleration acceleration distance grew, and there's a lot more of it. And so people still aren't stopping. They're still going about 10 miles an hour. So an artificial signage can actually make things less safe. So be careful about that if you're putting up intersection signs. And yeah, there's a lot more things we could talk about. We could talk a lot about the pedestrians and bicycle items. And again, we've only got an hour. In other words, I've got about 5 minutes with you. So I can't get into these in too much detail, but I do want you to understand there's a value in thinking about these things. So for instance, a crosswalk. Watch what happens. This intersection feels very unsafe. At a crosswalk, big difference. Okay? Intersection, technically, a pedestrian has the right of way at this intersection in New York State. Technically have the right of way. Nobody knows it. And so, if you really want pedestrians to cross, think about the value of the stripes. And from a driver's standpoint, you might not see an intersection, but if it's got a stripe, it's a lot easier to see. Okay. So think about the pedestrians and bicyclists, how they interact, dealing with intersections. And of course, if it's a mid-block crossing, absolutely you want some good signage. And you might even want to put up not just the signs, but even these rectangular rapid flashing beacons that when you push on them, they actually light up and you can see them flash. Okay. Some of them are automated, by the way. Or this is one you don't see very often. The pedestrian hybrid beacon, which is black most of the time, is not even turned on. It only turns on when the person's actually using it. Most of the time it's dark like this. It's actually a pretty cool feature. I actually went through one in Kansas City last week. I saw one for the first time live. Um, I'd seen them before. This is one in Milwaukee that I took a picture of, but nobody was using it except me, and so I couldn't get a good picture of it. But I was able to find one in Kansas City that I could get a video of. And if we have to do a class in this, I may throw it in. But yeah, there's all kinds of things we can think about, refuge islands, alternative stripes. But I'll be honest with you, keep it simple. Start with the basics. Think about the standards. These stripes look cool, but boy, they look sort of silly from the backside. Okay. So keep that in mind. So let's do our final review for our 3 hours together. Just a couple of quick things to go through here. What are some proven traffic safety countermeasures? So what have you learned that you might think about applying? Give me a few. Rumbles of different types, yep. Safety edge, or wedge is the way the state calls it, but either word's fine. Center line, rumble strips, shards in charge. Signs, yep. Okay. I'm looking for two in particular, which I think we should be adding to the pile. Pavement markings, that's one. That's one. And the other one, it's one of the most valuable ones that we don't sometimes think of the value of it. Delineation or signage. Yeah, just some good signs. Good, consistent signage. Remember, the manual on uniform traffic control devices, the single most important word is uniform. Consistency really can help improve safety. Okay? So proven countermeasures, they might be based on speed management, bicycles and pedestrians, roadway departure, intersections, and cross-cutting activities. Next week, we will be talking a lot more about the roadway departure and the cross-cutting ones and getting into more specifics and details, and that's what we're going to be covering. But just as a reminder, which one of these is not a proven countermeasure by the state or the feds? Improved curve signage, rumble strips, development of local road safety plan roundabouts, wide and clear zones. Ah, someone caught it. For roadway departures, which we're talking about next week, it is the roundabout. Okay? So local road safety plans are cross-cutting. They go through all of them. Roundabouts are still should be in your toolkit. They really should, but they're not for roadway departures. They're for intersections. Okay? And with that, let's see, how did I do time-wise? I'm doing pretty good. I promised you a minute back. Again, let's see if we got any new questions. With, again, the guide rail issue, it can actually help to move it back out if it meets the criteria so people would actually hit it. We'll talk about that a little bit next week. And we do actually have a webinar we did on guide rail not that long ago. Let's see, were there other ones? I thought there's the studies for reduction in speeds. There are studies out there in the world of traffic calming. Not necessarily as many as we might like to have, but there's a balancing act that has to be reached. And will we get into roadway safety and how it interacts with pedestrians and infrastructure? No more than what we just did. For this particular session, the state is developing an intersection safety action plan, and we will probably be helping out with some training there. And there we will be talking about pedestrians and bicyclists. And as I mentioned, we do have an update on our Complete Streets workshop. We're going to be rolling out a pilot, and then we just got to figure out when and how we're going to get it rolled out across the state. So watch this space. We'll hopefully see some of you next week for the proven countermeasures on roadway departures. And if you have any questions about things, what we do, our workshops, everything, go to our website, just search for NYS LTAP, go to the website directly, heck, search for Cornell Local Roads Program. ChatGPT might even find us. I'm not sure, I haven't checked. Everybody have yourself a great day, great week. Stay dry, but it's a lot cooler. Thank you very much and have a great day. Bye-bye.